Despite his relative youth, King Baelor had ruled for 10 years. Those who lived under his rule experienced a reign unlike any other before or since. A unique figure in unusual times, who came to the throne in part thanks to the death of his brother, and that brother had passed at the age of only 18. Baelor's death remains a bit of a mystery. In some ways, it's not surprising. After all, the man starved himself regularly. On the other hand, this is a man who survived, walking all the way to Dorne and back, and all those vipers. On the other hand, there's a lot of reason to believe he was murdered, that the starvation made for a convincing cover story. And it may have been his hand who did the deed, his own uncle, Viserys, who became king after him. But why would Viserys, who ruled capably his hand for 20-ish years, kill his nephew after so much time? Did Viserys become ambitious later in life? Or did Baelor's policy decisions threaten to destabilize the realm? Was there a compelling reason rather than ambition? Yes, there is evidence Baelor was on a downward slope with regards to his mental health. Some of his decisions were downright insane, and he wasn't a fan of other religions. Now, kinslaying is one of the worst crimes in Westeros, but if Viserys thought he was preventing a civil war, or a holy war of sorts, well, that's a lot more interesting than regicide for reasons of personal gain. However, Viserys is not the only possible culprit, so we'll go over the other suspects. But this is not a whodunit episode, only it's just part of the episode, not just because his death was maybe not even a murder at all. Though 10 years is a substantial reign, arguably Baelor has had a bigger impact in Westeros since his death as compared to while he was alive. Baelor is one of the most frequently mentioned kings. Honestly, if we counted, he might even be the most mentioned. His influence goes well beyond frequent name drops, though, of course. He's the example of restraint, holiness, forbearance, forgiveness, piety, you name it, other related concepts included. His legacy is of the utmost importance in the history of Westeros, both due to scope and uniqueness, and we get a bonus murder mystery to go along with it. We've got all that and more on this episode of History of Westeros podcast. Hello and welcome back. It's part 3 of our series on Baelor. Each episode works as a standalone, and honestly, I think this one might be the most interesting because of what I just said in the intro, because of the long-lasting impact that came after his life, which is what we're focused on. And just like the other 2 episodes, we've got our returning guest, Nina Krusling, to join us to discuss Baelor, our resident Baelor expert, worldwide Baelor expert, I would say. And we are going to have a lot of fun with this one. Don't you think?
I would agree. You know, this is why I can only be on the show every 4 years, because what I have as ideas turns into, from one episode, a mega series of 3 episodes.
It's not a light commitment, yeah.
But it's fun. It's always fun to talk Baelor. So
it is indeed, and we've got some good stuff for y'all today. I'm going to set things up. We've got a little bit of context and some world building. And then we'll dive into the questions, which will be a series of unleashing of Nina on various subtopics, and that's going to be a lot of fun. So I'll set her up, she'll knock them down, and we'll see what Baelor has for us. In part 2, we talked about Baelor's rule as king. For 10 years, he reigned. He made it pretty clear he was not going to listen to anyone but himself when it came to his decrees. Well, according to him, he was listening to the Seven. But the Seven, they got a little stranger as time went, coincidentally, as he also got stranger, so go figure. His reign had been controversial from the beginning because he had been doing this shaping of the realm into what he believed the gods wanted from the moment he took the crown. So the Seven wanted him to make peace with Dorne, so he walked all that long way to do it, end his brother's war, make peace, make good, make amends. And the Seven wanted him to keep his sisters from tempting the men around him, including himself, so he imprisoned them in the Maiden Vault. All these things. The burning of the books of people like Mushroom, Sept, and Barth. All these things. Baelor may not have been wielding steel like his brother Daeron, but his will was just as iron. He was just as determined. He was just as proud. He had no compunctions and no self-doubt, it seems. Now, Baelor wasn't the only figure in his government. Even if he believed he was the agent of the Seven, he still had helpers. All 10 years of his reign, his uncle, Viserys was his hand. By 171, Viserys was 50 years old, however, and had been hand to 3 kings in a row over the course of 3 or 4 decades. So he is just super long-term part of government and at the top. So for any Westerosi aristocrat, this is significant. Very few people have a career like Viserys. And that's what makes some of the questions in this episode so very interesting. He had both the experience of ruling and the experience in seeing things go wrong. He had been around during the dance. He had been around during Daeron, the first attempted conquest of Dorne, which succeeded initially and then collapsed. So he has this perspective on the long term, on war and peace. And, well, he would have opinions on what Baelor was doing and what impact it would have on the realm in turn. But in 171, Baelor was only 27 years old. Even though that's pretty young, that's 10-year reign, more than double the reign of Daeron, but not, of course, not nearly as long as the 26-year reign of Aegon III or the 55 years under Jaehaerys I. So he had a shot at those numbers, at catching some of those records, so to speak. But, of course, he ended up well short of them, given what actually happened. So people probably looked forward to this 10, 20, 30 more years of his reign. So it was very surprising, probably very sad for a lot of people. A lot of nobles might have actually privately been like, phew, while a lot of commoners in huge numbers would have wept and been upset and maybe doubted what really happened and would have wondered and tore their clothing and all the things that you do when you're in mourning. The end of the reign. Before we get to Baelor's death, though, let's talk about the last year or so of his life, because it includes the factors that might have led to his potential murder. This is when his fasting was really getting out of hand, and though it may not have been the main trigger, it's hard to be rational when you're starving, and he wasn't the most rational guy in the first place. He had visions when he fasted, and that's part of why he kept fasting. He thought that it was bringing him closer to the gods, and he was a man who wanted to be close to the gods. He wanted to be holy. So it's actually kind of logical when you look at it that way, even though that it's also not logical at all in another, looking at it another way. So in this state of mind, he ruled the 7 kingdoms. So when he wasn't busy praying, he was getting visions born of hunger. So people had to be noticing this escalation, right? What do you suppose, Nina, the mood at court was after 10 years of this, and it clearly was getting worse, and he was clearly doing things a little weirder and escalating. Yeah, what do you think?
I think it's so interesting to think about this sort of last year or last period of Baelor's life and his reign, because to me, I have to think that there was this sense at court of unease and maybe even anxiety about the future. And I think to some extent we can compare that to the end of Viserys I's reign, although I think in other ways the two periods were very, very different. But what I think is so similar between the end of Viserys I's reign and the end of Baelor's reign is this question of the succession. Who's going to come next when the king dies? We see this very obviously in Viserys I's reign with the Black and Green factions. Viserys had created a succession conflict that he didn't want to solve. He set up both his eldest son and his eldest daughter to have very colorable claims to the Iron Throne, creating the Black and Green factions. And as his reign progressed and eventually, sort of came to a close, what those factions became is not just more vehement in terms of believing that their respective candidates were the rightful heirs to the Iron Throne, but also more violent toward each other. And so everybody except the king himself can see there's going to be a conflict at his death. There might even be a civil war, which of course there is at his death. Neither faction is going to step back and let the other one go. They're going to fight over the Iron Throne. And I think, to some extent, that sort of feeling and attitude may have been present at the end of Baelor's reign as well. Obviously, we don't see something as formalized as the Black and Green factions at the end of Baelor's reign. But I think what his contemporaries and courtiers would have seen is a real question over the succession and a number of imperfect candidates. Baelor had made it very clear when he returned from Dorne, I'm not going to have children of my body. And unlike when Baelor himself succeeded, there were no more brothers. There were no more sons of Aegon III who would be the natural successors to take over if he died childless. And so the question remains, well, who comes next? His closest relatives are his 3 sisters, but these are not perfect candidates. Number one, because patriarchy is going to patriarchy in Westeros, and these are young women. And not just young women, objectively, but Rhaenyra's granddaughters. Again and again and again, I mention we're still in the shadow of the dance. This is the first generation of Targaryens that are born after the dance. So the idea of a woman sitting the Iron Throne, it's a hot-button topic, to say the least. It's not something that's going to be very simply, very widely accepted. And on top of that, what also puts these princesses at a disadvantage is that they've been quite literally imprisoned for 10 years. Rhaenyra at least had the advantage of being able to go around the realm, to show herself as Viserys' heir, to make marriage alliances for herself and her children. These princesses can't do that. Dana and Rhaena and Olenna, they can't go around the realm and say, I should be Baelor's heir. They can't make marriage alliances for themselves with powerful aristocrats. They can't have children with powerful aristocrats who are going to be seen as Baelor's successors. And that puts them at a disadvantage. They don't have that sort of popular, strong, noble support that's going to carry them onto the Iron Throne if and when the king dies. But if it's not his sisters who succeed, well, then who should it be? We talked, I believe, in the second part about maybe Baelor had looked at young Prince Daeron, the son of the eventual Aegon the Unworthy, himself eventually Daeron II, as a future king, as his possible heir. But again, I think this would have been seen as, at best, imperfect. Yes, Daeron is a male. Yes, Daeron is a prince of a male line, but he's also the son and grandson of princes and male line princes of House Targaryen. Is there going to be popular, widespread support for a prince succeeding a king when his father and grandfather have just as good, if not better, claims than his own? Not to mention, of course, whatever lingering Westerosi xenophobia exists against Daeron's marriage to Mariah Martell and his children that he's starting to have with Mariah. So again, this is a series of very imperfect candidates. No one's sure exactly who's going to take over. There is no rulebook here. And so I think that would have been leaving this sense of unease for everyone as to, well, what's going to happen?
And there wasn't much they could seemingly do about it. As we discussed, Baelor was going to Baelor, and that meant, well, not caving in on any issue he didn't want to cave in on. So for 10 years, he didn't name a successor. There was no obvious successor. And life carried on with this sort of anxious, well, sword of Baelor, a weird metaphor for a guy who didn't use swords. But the point is the same, and this is why it's so similar to the layout for the Dance of the Dragons, which is that there was an issue of succession. And a lot of people saw this coming. Another example is that Dana the Defiant had a pregnancy with Aegon, who became Aegon the Unworthy. She might have seen the writing on the wall and known who might have been very likely to be king in the future, and thus had a child with him and was looking ahead. So, thus setting up the Blackfyre Rebellions, which is, of course, a great parallel to the Dance of the Dragons. It's a big Targaryen civil war set up by multiple branches after a failed succession. One pretty major difference, though, is what we just mentioned before that, which was that it was kind of a surprise that Baelor died, unlike Viserys, whose health was very visibly declining slowly and surely, and he was also much older, so there was both health and age, whereas for Baelor, maybe there were some health questions because of the way he treated himself, but the guy was only 27, so for the most part, that's a big, big difference, right? The suddenness of it versus the slow decline.
Oh, absolutely. And it's not just the suddenness. One of the aspects of Viserys' reign you bring up, Viserys was on a decline for the better part of 10 years before his death. He has gout, he has back problems, he has heart problems. He can't eventually climb the steps of the Red Keep, climb the stairs of the Iron Throne. At the end of his life, he can't even get out of bed. And what this does is it informs specifically the Green faction, who is physically present with the king in the Red Keep, that they know to start preparing, start laying the groundwork to make sure that, for them, Aegon the Elder succeeds the moment the king dies. Alicent knows that she can put a servant in the household to inform her because even though she might not know the day or hour that the king is going to die, she knows it's going to be soon, and she needs to be ready to move the moment the king breathes his last. The problem with Baelor is exactly what you point out. Nobody knows when Baelor is going to die. He's only 27. That's not old, even by Westerosi standards. And what you mentioned at the beginning, he's the son and the grandson of kings who had fairly lengthy, well, I should say the son of a king who had a fairly lengthy reign, and the descendant of a king who reigned for 55 years. So the problem, but then, as you mentioned, is Baelor's also going on these long, extended fasts. And what that does is create two very distinct, very disparate, and very extreme scenarios. On the one hand, maybe Baelor doesn't go on a fast for a long time and reigns 10, 20, 30 years. Or maybe Baelor goes on a fast tomorrow and dies the next day. And how are you supposed to prepare for the succession if you have no idea which of those is more likely? You can't. You can't do that. Do you even know what candidates are going to be alive when the king dies? Do you know what aristocrats are going to be alive when the king dies? Do you know what the mood is going to be when the king dies? There's quite simply no way to know. And so I think for Baelor's courtiers, there would have been this something of a knife edge where, on the one hand, they've got a king who is becoming increasingly erratic, increasingly impractical, but they also have no idea, A, what's going to happen when he dies, and B, when he's going to die. So it's this, as you point out, this, what we might call, in a bad metaphor, the Valyrian sword of Damocles, that is hanging above everyone, and no one knows when it's going to drop.
And this brings us to some of the more interesting questions and concerns, which is, well, the timing actually worked out pretty well. When he died, it didn't cause big problems. His uncle just took over, and, well, things got a lot more interesting after that, since his uncle only lived another year and a couple months and was perhaps poisoned himself. But that's another story. Anyway, the point is a war didn't break out. So that's obviously a huge difference. War would break out much later with the Blackfire rebellions, but that's not till another 25 years. So these are reasonable concerns and for people to have anxiety about what's going to happen at court. Whether Baelor had been a good or a bad king, this is going to be a question. So this is part of why I think it's fair to view Baelor as gray. Obviously, there's the extremes in his life. There's so many things he did quite well that you appreciate and respect about him. But this is such a basic duty of kingship, which is to make sure the succession is smooth. It's such an obvious way for the realm to collapse in on itself, for thousands of people to die, is by having a succession crisis. It's the most straightforward thing that can go wrong, really, in a monarchy. And Baelor did not handle that. So I think it's fair to criticize him for that in a very similar way to Viserys I, as you say. And if, for example, Viserys I had handled his succession well, of course, not only would it have averted civil war, but it would erase a lot of what otherwise was a very mediocre reign. For Baelor, it's not so simple, is it? Because this is a guy that was so up and down, so extreme, so popular with the commons, so unpopular with the nobility. And that's what makes him so unique in the first place. So what do we think his reasoning was? Do we have any idea, maybe, or any guesses as to why he didn't name a succession? I mean, is it just because he thought the gods would let him know someday, and he too realized how young he was and maybe wasn't worried about it? Or any other ideas?
Honestly, it sounds very simple to say it, I don't think Baelor thought he was going to die. I genuinely think that Baelor just simply didn't think the gods were done with him, didn't think that his work with the Seven was done. And so why would he plan for a world where he wouldn't exist if he believed that he was literally the agent of the Seven on Earth to do their will? There was still clearly a lot to be done, as we're going to talk about in just a moment, as far as Baelor believed. So he's not working to make sure that, I need to plan for the day that I'm not here. I think in Baelor's mind it was, no, I personally still have a lot to do. I'm not planning for the day that someone else is taking over for that.
And this would have been easier to swallow early on because he was even younger and even earlier in his growing erratic behavior. The bar chart of his erraticism increases over time. But as he got farther along, he started to do at least talk about things that might have caused serious problems, and not just with the succession. For example, he came to believe that the Seven wanted him to convert all the unbelievers in the realm. Now, I think a lot of y'all understand that there's a lot of non-Seven worshippers in the realm. There's the entirety of the North and the entirety of the Iron Islands. Well, maybe not the entirety, but mostly, for the most part, those are realms that have very little worship of the Seven. And there are some, of course, in the South that don't worship the Seven, that do worship the old gods or perhaps the drowned god here and there. And, of course, the Relorists here and there and the occasional other worshipper. Now, that, of course, is a big deal. And it's not just a big deal because it could cause extreme amounts of violence. I mean, we could call this tyranny, couldn't we?
I think you can. I think if it's not tyranny, it is something very, very close to tyranny. Baelor is saying, I'm declaring war on my own subjects, not because they've committed a crime, not because they're in rebellion against me, not because they've committed treason. I'm going to war against my own people because they're practicing a religion or multiple religions, that from the earliest days of the Targaryen conquest, not to mention long before that, they had practiced. The Targaryens had always recognized the North and the Iron Islands and these pockets of old gods or, drowned god worship. Now Baelor is saying, no, actually, not only am I going to make sure that you don't do that, I'm going to go to war with you and kill you until you accept that you can't do that. And this is a real dangerous thing for a king to do, to start a war against his own people on the basis of religion. There's a couple of historical examples in Westeros of kings doing this, and spoiler alert, it never went well for the kings who were involved in this. You look at someone like Humphrey Teague. Humphrey Teague seems to have been a king very much in the model of Baelor. He's a historical king of the Riverlands. He's a very pious king, very zealous king, and he decides, I don't want any more old gods worship in the Riverlands, so I'm going to stamp it out. I'm just going to go to war to make sure that no one can worship the old gods. Well, what happens? He gets a rebellion of his vassals. And here's what's important. It's not just the Blackwoods who rebel against him. Obviously, they have a vested interest because they worship the old gods. But it's also the Tullys and the Vances. Because what I think they recognized, and if so correctly recognized, is that the king saying today, I can go to war against you because I don't like the way that you practice religion, means that tomorrow the king can come up with a different kind of tyranny and attack any of his other vassals. None of them are safe if the king can do this. And what happens is not just a war that encompasses the entirety of the Riverlands. This becomes a truly international conflict because the Durandans invade to support the Blackwoods. And what it leads to is the downfall of House Teague and the elimination of the Riverlands as an independent political entity. The Teagues fall and the Durandans simply absorb the Riverlands as an imperial conquest. So, yeah, bad idea, Humphrey Teague. Real bad idea for you to do that. And I think, in a way, although, it sounds strange to say it because they couldn't be more opposite in their, relation to the faith, but in a way, this might not have seemed so different from Maegor. Again, Maegor's no friend to the faith. He basically declares war on the faith. But what it leads to is a war in which thousands and thousands of his subjects are personally killed by the king for siding with the faith. And what happens? Does Maegor eliminate the faith in Westeros? No, not at all. In fact, quite the opposite. Everyone abandons Maegor. Everyone rallies not just to the faith, but to Jaehaerys, to his rival, to his nephew. And Maegor dies alone and friendless and is remembered as a cruel tyrant. So the reason I bring these up is to say, the idea of a king who decides to declare war on his people on the basis of religion, it's not a good idea for Baelor. There's not good historical precedent for him to do this.
Yeah, and if you go back even farther, it's not a good idea for humanity to go up against the old gods. They had a whole pact and everything. It was a whole deal, and we're still learning things about that. It was so long ago. So this plan for a crusade of sorts against non-believers. Yeah, you're right. That would have been a lot like Maegor. Instead of a war against the faithful, it would have been a war against the non-faithful. Either way, those are his subjects, like you say. That's awful. And this isn't that long after the dance. We're talking 4 decades. And even more recently, the failure in Dorne, which that cost a lot of lives and cost a lot of goodwill and created a lot of bad feelings and broken homes and families. There weren't any more dragons, but you don't need dragons to cause devastation. You know, they're very helpful in that regard, but still, you can do quite a lot without them. So, especially like you say, when it's a religious type war where people get really dug in and it's about their beliefs and what makes them dig in perhaps more than anything and fight to the death more than anything. So yeah, it's a really, you can really understand why this is the sort of thing that someone might kill you over before you can get started. So let's move forward to why he was not able to launch any such war or campaign of any kind whatsoever. And that's because, well, he wasn't around to do so. Death. Just as Baelor was dreaming up this crusade of sorts, dreaming quite literally perhaps, he got a significant shock.
The eventual birth of Daemon Waters, the natural child of Daena Targaryen by a father she refused to name, but whom the realm later learned was none other than her cousin, Aegon, while he was still a prince, led to another fit of fasting by the king. He had already nearly killed himself some years before, when he fasted for a moon's turn following the deaths of his cousin Princess Nerys' twins shortly after their delivery. This time, Baelor took it yet further, refusing anything but water and taking only enough bread to still the cries of his stomach.
So, Nina, let's talk about why Baelor had such an extreme reaction to the birth of young Daemon.
Yeah, I think, I think when Baelor learned about baby Daemon's birth, I think he saw it as a personal failure on his part, meaning on Baelor's part, because it was his idea to imprison Daena and his sisters in the Maiden Vault, and he did it specifically to keep them away from men. He did not want them tempting the men of his realm, including, obviously, Baelor himself. And so what he's finding is Daena making what I think he would have thought of, making a mockery of that, saying, no, not only am I going to be in the Maiden Vault, but I'm actually going to have a child while I'm in the Maiden Vault. I'm going to do exactly what you didn't want me to do. I'm going to, again, in Baelor's mind, use my beauty to tempt the unknown father of this child into having this child with me. And I don't think it helped the situation, at least in Baelor's mind, that Daena was being pretty incendiary with his name. He was being pretty deliberate in choosing this name for her baby, because what Yandel says is that Daena specifically named her baby Daemon after their paternal grandfather, Prince Daemon, because Prince Daemon had been what Yandel refers to as the wonder and terror of his age. And I think for Baelor, that would have made the situation just that much more embarrassing and, in Baelor's mind, that much more awful, because he doesn't want to think of himself or his era as anything similar to Daemon, as, someone who not only doesn't seem to have been particularly pious, but someone who's famous for his warmongering, famous for his love affairs. That's not the ancestor I think Baelor is looking to for inspiration. So the idea that his sister that he's trying to mold into piety like himself is now looking for inspiration to this, rogue of a grandfather. I think he would have just found that whole situation so personally humiliating and so embarrassing that he personally needs to repent for it. He personally needs to take that on to sort of expiate what he saw as Dana's sin.
Yeah, I agree, because he did have that, it's his responsibility type attitude about, well, everything. Like the soul of Westeros was his responsibility. So any infraction like this, especially amongst his own family, especially amongst, like you said, people he had specifically targeted for a specific type of control, that did not work. It backfired spectacularly because Dana got pregnant. And we already know, according to faith doctrine, Faith of the Seven, they don't look too kindly on women and relationships, especially extramarital affairs. So that would be something he also took personally, I would think, right? He would blame himself for that. And, well, there's a few other, maybe some parallels here we can discuss, aren't there?
No, absolutely. I mean, I don't want to paint, a broad brush and say everyone in the faith believes the same thing when it comes to women in relationships. Obviously, everyone is different. But what we see very clearly with the High Sparrow, for example, who himself very much takes Baelor as a model, what the High Sparrow says to Cersei is quite explicitly misogynistic. It is all women are wantons at heart, and widows especially so. They're all willing to use their beauty to tempt men. This is what the representative of the voice of the Seven on Earth is telling Cersei. So I think Baelor, again, we made comparisons between the High Sparrow and Baelor before. I think Baelor might have believed something similar, that, if women are wantons at heart, well, this just proves it. Look at that. I did everything in my power, Baelor thinks, to make sure that they couldn't do it, and they did it anyway. So it's just confirming this, idea in his mind. And again, I think that's adding to what Baelor would have seen as his personal humiliation. Dana is having a child. Obviously, she's not married to the father of this child. So she is, in Baelor's mind, fulfilling what he thinks are the worst fears for what women can do.
Yeah, absolutely. He would frame it all that way because that's his very tight and sincerely held worldview that's fairly unshakable. So he wouldn't have these questions about what happened. He would take it as it came, and it would be very shameful, like you said, something that required penance, like you said, and maybe extreme penance. And that's exactly what happened. It was extreme penance that came, and an extreme result. Whether that result was helped along is something we'll discuss in a moment, but there's no doubt what he did was, well, wow. Quote,
"For 40 days he kept his regimen. On the 41st day, he was found collapsed before the altar of the mother. Grand Maester Munkin did what he could to heal the king. So, too, did the boy High Septon. But his miracles were at an end. The king joined the Seven in the 10th year of his reign, in 171 AC.
So this was not the first time Baelor had gone on extreme fast, but this probably was the longest as far as we know, and that is really long, 41 days. I mean, goodness, just bread and water for 41 days. Hard to imagine what that would do to a person. We hear from Yandel that as his reign came to a close, the king, quote, began to spend more and more time fasting and praying, attempting to make up for all the sins and offenses he believed he and his subjects were committing on a daily basis. So it wasn't just this. This was perhaps the biggest event that weighed on his mind in recent weeks or months, the birth of young Daemon. But there were other things that weighed on him, and his escalating mental health problems, madness, whatever you want to frame it as, whatever you call it, it was getting worse. Yandel notes here, too, that Baelor fasted when Nerys gave birth to 2 short-lived children. So whether he was ashamed of that or just thought it was the thing to do to get guidance or to communicate with the gods, really fasting was just his go-to response to a lot of things, really a lot of major events, whether they were something that you could say he was taking responsibility for or something else maybe was on his mind. But as we mentioned before, he did this kind of regularly, so it wasn't exactly something that people would expect to have such extreme consequences, was it?
No, absolutely. And this goes back to the point that I was making before, is that, in the same way that no one knows what's going to happen with any given fast, this was not, as you say, Baelor's first fast. He's not his first rodeo, so to speak. And we see in this fast, even though Baelor is obviously taking a very extreme measure, he's only getting as much food and water as he believes is necessary to survive day to day. He is taking that food and water. So I think that Baelor himself did believe that, fasting didn't mean consume nothing. It just meant deny yourself everything except the basic sustenance to live. So I think it still would have been seen as very shocking and very sudden that that this is what kills the king, that when he had gone on fasts before, when he's still relatively young, when he is, fasting aside, seemingly otherwise pretty healthy, that all of a sudden he's drop dead, and that's the end of Baelor's reign.
So suspicions arose pretty quickly that the king's death wasn't exactly natural. Poisoning? After Baelor died, his uncle Viserys became king after having been hanged. We'll talk a bit more later about the transition to power, but let's focus for the moment on these suspicions around Baelor's death. Quote,
malicious rumors that followed in the wake of Viserys' ascension, begun, some say, by the pen of the Lady Maya of House Stokeworth, suggested that Viserys poisoned the king in order to finally gain the throne after a decade and more of waiting. Others have suggested that Viserys poisoned Baelor for the good of the realm, since the Septon king had come to believe that the Seven called on him to convert all the unbelievers in his realm. This would have led to a war with the North and the Iron Islands that would have caused great turmoil.
So it's interesting that some of these rumors started with Maya Stokeworth, given that Viserys' son Aegon was in a relationship with Felina Stokeworth, later Felina Lothston, some 20 years before Baelor's death. What do we think was the relationship between those two, Maya and Felina?
That's a huge question for me. And I don't know. I've not known what to make of it for the 10 years that we've had the World of Ice and Fire. I don't know that I've ever seen a really good theory as to why George R. R. Martin made this specifically Maya Stokeworth who is giving this rumor. Is it just a red herring? Is it something that is being informed by Felina? Are they sisters? Are they cousins? I don't know. I don't know. I think it's something that I'm very curious to see if Fire and Blood has more information on. Obviously, the Stokeworths are, for lack of a better term, in the Targaryens' backyard, so they are as close as physically possible to being near to court, hearing about these rumors, so it may just be as simple as that, but it also may bring in this dimension that, Maya clearly is some kind of relation to Felina Stokeworth, Lady Felina Lothston, and to the extent that Felina and Aegon still have any kind of personal connection at this point, there may be something more there to these rumors.
Yeah, absolutely. I got to agree. I mean, Aegon does eventually end up king within just a couple years here, and with all the things we discussed about potentially starting civil war, there's so much motive here, not to mention Baelor's other anti-noble policies and his mental health problems. So it's fascinating, too, how much this is a question not just for us, but in world. We know that these rumors have made it into present day, as we see discussed in A Storm of Swords here. This is a fantastic conversation, an exchange between some different characters right here.
Oberyn gave a shrug.
A year or a fortnight, what does it matter? He poisoned his own nephew to gain the throne and then did nothing once he had it.
Baelor starved himself to death fasting, said Tyrion. His uncle served him loyally as hand, as he had served the young dragon before him. Viserys might only have reigned a year, but he ruled for 15. While Daeron warred and Baelor prayed, he made a sour face. And if he did remove his nephew, can you blame him? Someone had to save the realm from Baelor's follies.
Now, George isn't so simple as to suggest poisoning and for us to take that as an automatic. He's clever enough and subtle enough to mix it up, to suggest poisoning, and it doesn't have to mean that that's the case, because it's going to be rational sometimes for people to think about a poisoning and it not always be the case. It can't always be a poisoning, right? But when we don't know, it's fair to ask the question, even if we can't get to the answer. Yandel deliberately introduces the idea, but Tyrion doubts it, right? I love this. We get so many different takes, and some not just on the murder potential, but on Baelor himself. And it's a character that we don't see explored like this very often for a historical figure. Sure, we see this discussed about Stannis or Renly or maybe even Robb or Ned, because those are characters in the present. But to have a character like this discussed in this light is really interesting, and it just shows just how much effort George put into Baelor. Now, there's two important caveats here to keep in mind when talking about him being poisoned. One, George has left himself an out to explain Baelor's death. We have the very strong cover story of, yes, his own health was questionable. It's not an automatic, but it's within the realm of, okay, yeah, he just had bad health from poor nutrition. Baelor had almost died after fasting from the death of Nerys' twin, so he went really far with that one, and according to Yandel, it almost took his life then. Now, what does that mean? What does it mean that he almost died? I mean, we don't know. He was on death's door because he didn't have enough food. They gave him some food and he started feeling better. I don't know how it works with starvation in that sense, and every case is probably a little unique, and he wasn't in a normal situation. So it's hard to say. So it's entirely possible he died of quote unquote natural causes, but the number two example here is, or possibility, is that he wants us to consider the possibility of poisoning, but that's just part of where he wants to leave it, right? He doesn't intend for us to know. He intends to leave it as a question. That's a very strong possibility, isn't it?
It is. And George R. Martin does this sometimes, where he'll give the possibility of a certain conclusion or maybe several, conclusions to a situation, but then ultimately leaves it up to the reader to decide. What do you think happened? What you think happened? Well, that's your theory. You get to decide that as the reader. So you think of, for example, comparison, the death of King Aenys. We know Aenys is in extremely poor health at the end of his life. We also know that there are rumors that Visenya poisoned Aenys. She's there, and there is an argument that she had motive to do it. Does that mean that Visenya poisoned Aenys? Well, not necessarily. The author leaves it ambiguous. He doesn't answer the question. And so it's left up for us as the readers. Do you think it's more likely that Aenys simply died of natural causes, or that Visenya poisoned him? And, this isn't poisoning, but I think it's a useful comparison. You think about the way that Fire and Blood presents the deaths of Laenor Velaryon and then the Strongs, Lionel and Harwin Strong, during what's called the Year of the Red Spring. And again, speaking specifically to the book, not to the way that the TV show presents it. George R. Martin doesn't give us an answer as to why Carl Corey kills Laenor. He doesn't give us an answer as to who, if anyone, set the fire at Harrenhal that killed the Strongs. He gives us a lot of possibilities, but he doesn't settle on any one of them. It's for us as the reader to decide, what do you think is the most likely? Are any of these the most likely? Or is there something that the author doesn't even mention that you think is more likely than that? Ultimately, it's not something that we're ever going to get a firm answer on. It's a mystery, a riddle that's left for us as the readers to solve, which is really fun. As readers, we get to analyze, we get to piece it together, and we get to make theories. But it's not something that we should ever expect sort of word of God as the author to say, yeah, and this is what happened here.
1,000%. I mean, that's George R. Martin. This is the world he's created, and we don't get answers like that. There is no narrator. He treats it like real history, like we're doing now, and that's not a thing you get real answers in. You get versions, you get theories, you get ideas, and then you pick the one that works best for you, which in a way is great for a story too, because you get to use your imagination more than just being told something. All that said, what do you think? Where do you fall on the idea that Baelor was poisoned?
The shorter answer is yes. I think he was poisoned. I do think he was poisoned. All of those caveats aside, and I do think there are important caveats to keep in mind, absolutely recognized. But yeah, I think he was poisoned, and I think Viserys did it. And the reason I think Viserys did it is because, put simply, I think Viserys decided that he had to choose between the king and the realm. And Viserys' choice was the realm, not the king. It's important for us to keep in mind what Viserys' political background was. It's not an exaggeration at all, I think, to say that Viserys grows up in political chaos. First, he sees the outbreak of the dance when he's still a child. Then he is captured and basically sold into exile in Lys. Then he returns to Westeros, and he's immediately thrown into the chaos of the Regency. So he spends his entire adolescence and early adult life seeing this political chaos all around him. He sees what the Civil War did in terms of destruction, both to the kingdom and to his family. He sees, via the Rogaires, how quickly even a very powerful family can implode, how quickly popular forces can turn against a popular family. He sees with the Regency how much backbiting and infighting there can be even among people who should ostensibly have the same political goal, which for the regents was ruling the realm until Aegon III became an adult. And for the better part of at least 20 years, if not more, Viserys had been serving as hand to 3 successive kings. It was Viserys' job to rebuild the realm when Aegon III was king. It was Viserys' job to keep the realm together when Daeron was making war in Dorne. And so what Viserys gained was 2 decades or more of acting as basically king in all but name. He is ruling with all the powers of an executive while his brother is withdrawn and while Daeron is quite literally gone. And I think while he's serving under Aegon III and under Daeron, Viserys probably felt more or less in line ideologically and politically with what the kings wanted. Certainly with his brother. We know that Viserys and Aegon were personally extremely close as brothers. And I think they became even closer during that regency when they are literally besieged together. They go through this chaos together, and Viserys becomes the one person that Aegon believes that he can trust. And together they've got this shared goal of, we saw how awful the dance was. Now let's put the realm back together. Let's rebuild. Let's restore peace and justice and stability. And obviously that's not quite what Daeron's goal was. Daeron's goal was conquest in Dorne, but there is precedent for that in Targaryen history. There is precedent for Targaryen kings to go and try and conquer Dorne, and that's probably augmented because Daeron did, at least for a brief time, succeed quite spectacularly in doing that. So I think that Viserys more or less felt comfortable in terms of ruling as hand under these kings. And then Daeron dies, and Baelor comes, and Baelor is a very different king from either his father or his brother. We mentioned this at the very, very first episode. Baelor is just as strong-willed as Daeron, but in the complete opposite direction. He's not just focused on peace and piety. He's trying to rule in ways that have little to no basis in reality. And that's making Viserys' job really difficult. Because now it's his job to implement the king's will, to make good on what the king wants, even though the king's wishes really don't have much, if any, practicality to them. And, obviously, for the better part of 10 years, Viserys is trying to do this. Viserys is ruling his hand, and as far as we know, he's loyally serving his hand. But I think over the course of that decade, Viserys was probably becoming pretty jaded as to the situation. Here he is, he's got all of this intelligence, he's got all of this experience, and yet he's spending it serving a king who has all of the will of a strong king, but none of the ideas of how to rule practically. And all of that, I think, comes to a head when Baelor decides he wants to go on this war against non-believers. Because again, we mentioned this before, Viserys is a survivor of the dance. There's probably not going to be anything more shocking to him, more horrifying to him, than the idea of a king who willingly wants to go to war against his own people, who actively wants to throw the realm back into civil war. I think in Viserys' mind, he's thinking, you blockhead, you've learned nothing. You learned nothing from the dance. Didn't you see how our family was almost destroyed? Didn't you see how the kingdom was almost destroyed? And now you want to do it again? What's wrong with you? And I think this is the moment that Viserys thinks, I gotta get rid of this guy. I can't let him keep going. I can't just sit here. He needs to go. It's not just that I'm going to try and rule for him. I need to get him out of here. And conveniently for Viserys, I think at that moment, he has a very easy excuse to do it. Baelor's on this fast. That's a real easy way for Viserys to make it look, for lack of a better term, like a natural death. Oh, unfortunate, the king just happened to go on a little too long of a fast. And Viserys also knows that if Baelor dies, naturally or unnaturally, he, Viserys, is going to be best placed to immediately step into power. So I think Viserys had means, Viserys had motive, Viserys had opportunity. I think Viserys is the one who killed him.
Well put, well said. It's a strong case. I mean, it both serves the realm as a man who had served the realm all along and makes the power transition very easy, even if it couldn't look very self-serving since the power transfers to him. But, as an extreme action, it was arguably an extreme circumstance. Now, the Visenya Aenys parallel is very strong in terms of the murder mystery angle and in terms of whether it even happened and the fact that we have a king who's already in questionable health circumstances before their death. So that similar muddying of the waters is there. But in terms of the motivation, in terms of what would be caused by the king were they to remain in power, what do you think is a good parallel or two that we can think about here?
Well, I think, and it sounds perhaps a little strange to say it this way, and I think the comparison is limited, but I think we can look in certain ways to the relationship between Jon Snow and Bowen Marsh in A Dance with Dragons. Now, again, I want to be really, really clear here. By saying this, I am not saying Bowen was right, or Jon was a dummy, or you need to side with Bowen, or anything along those lines. But what I'm trying to point to is the idea of what I'll call, for lack of a better term, a long-serving, high-ranking civil servant who initially tries to work with a young teenage executive, but eventually decides that that executive is far too dangerous to his institution to be allowed to rule and even to be allowed to live. When we started Dance with Dragons, Bowen Marsh doesn't start chapter 1, Jon 1, by saying, all right, time to kill Jon. He's not Jon's best friend by any stretch of the imagination, but he is trying to do what Bowen believes is his job. But what we see again and again and again in Jon's chapters is that he and Bowen Marsh are constantly butting heads ideologically. They are not on the same page in terms of what they believe the Watch should be about and the future of the Watch should be. And I think as Bowen is continuing to butt heads with Jon, what Bowen decides is eventually that Jon is simply too dangerous to be allowed to continue serving as Lord Commander. And yes, I think Bowen does at some point decide Jon has to go. Now, whether or not Bowen's original plan was to murder Jon, especially in the way he did, I'm not quite sure of that versus, deposing Jon. But I do think that Bowen obviously decided Jon can't be allowed to rule anymore. He's not acting the way a Lord Commander should be. He's acting like he's king at the Wall. He's acting like he's king in the North. He's acting not in the way that I, Bowen Marsh, think that the Lord Commander should act. And the especially strong, I think, comparison here is what is it that prompts Bowen Marsh into, assassinating Jon in the way he does? It's Jon's bombshell at the Shield Hall. It's Jon saying, guess what, lads? Not only am I going to send a bunch of you off to Hardhome on an overland mission to try and rescue the people there since my ship mission didn't go well, but also, I'm declaring war, essentially, on the Boltons, and I'm going to take a private army of whoever wants to join me to go fight them. I think in Bowen's mind, he would have felt quite the same as what I think Viserys felt, which is, oh my god, this guy needs to be stopped. He's not just a bad Lord Commander, he's now a tyrant Lord Commander, and he needs to be brought down. And what is Bowen Marsh's famous words to Jon as he's stabbing him? For the Watch. Bowen isn't doing it because he personally hates Jon. He's crying. He doesn't like doing this. He's doing it because in Bowen's mind, Jon is dangerous to the Watch. And when it comes between serving the Lord Commander and serving the Watch, in Bowen's mind, killing Jon is the only way to serve the Watch.
Yeah, it is. And that's, like you said, pointing to the fact that there were tears running down his face, I think is a huge tell of what was really on his mind and how difficult the decision was for him, which may have been very similar for Viserys. Now, Viserys, of course, has a cover story with the starvation, whereas Bowen and company had to go straight to the stabbing, which is very unsubtle, especially given we're in the POV's mind when it happens to him, so it's very unmistakable. But anyway, moving back to Baelor, there's another factor here too, because we add all this up for Viserys. If we think about everything facing him, the difficulty of balancing the realm versus his loyalty to his family versus kinslaying versus what might happen if he waits, which is a big unknown in his mind. Sure, he has experience and he can draw on that experience. He's intelligent, rational. He has the advice of other people around him, presumably counsel and the like. It's still a very difficult decision, which is arguably what the best thing to write about, right?
Say it with us, everyone. The human heart in conflict with itself. It is George R. R. Martin's favorite theme, and I think that is what is coming in here, too. It's Viserys, we lay out the argument, or at least I laid out the argument to say there's reasons that Viserys may have believed Baelor was a danger to the realm, and may have genuinely believed this. At the same time, this is his brother's last surviving son. This is his beloved brother's last surviving son. To save the realm, in Viserys' mind, he has to murder his brother's son. He has to betray his brother's legacy. He has to destroy the dynastic future that his brother had laid out. That's not an easy choice by any stretch of the imagination. And I imagine that Viserys may have wrestled with it, may have thought, can I do this? If I do this, am I the hero of the realm? Or am I Maegor, who's murdering my nephew just to take the crown? It may have seemed a very blurred line to him. And, I think it is worth considering. Viserys' grandson, Bloodraven, I think was caught in a similar dilemma, because what does he have to do on the Redgrass field? He has to murder his brother and his nephews, and I firmly believe that Bloodraven loved Daemon Blackfyre, which is exactly why it would have been just as difficult of a choice. Saving the realm doesn't mean making easy choices in the minds of these individuals. It means doing what they think ultimately needs to be done, but having to deal with the emotional and personal consequences of that.
Absolutely. And that's part of why power has to be such a big part of the story, because you have to have these personal consequences weighed against some large consequence outside of yourself, which in this case is generally the realm, generally Westeros or a large portion of it or something like along those lines. I like as well the idea of comparing this to Rhaegar and Aerys, who, he apparently was thinking about deposing his father and would have presumably done so peaceably and with support if it gone the way he had hoped for. I assume he wouldn't have wanted violence, but that's a thing that never actually happened. Some other interesting notes from the quotes there. Grand Maester Munkin did what he could to save the king. This is presumably the same Munkin who became regent for Aegon III, which means he was both a witness to and an expert on the dance. He quite literally wrote the book on the Civil War, even if Tyrion disagrees with some of it. Munkin had also shown an unwillingness to acknowledge Aegon III's half-sisters, Baela and Rhaena, as Aegon's heirs if the king died childless, so just because they were women. So there's obviously some bias here at work on Munkin's part. But regardless of that, did what he could to save the king. That's interesting. That means that maybe he wasn't completely dead when they found him passed out on the altar or what have you. And either way, it's possible that Munkin would have supported Viserys if there was a conspiracy, because Viserys probably didn't just do it on his own, right? He would have needed the help. He would have needed to acquire poison. Someone had to help him. I mean, even if he did the poisoning himself, there's still the acquisition of it. It's hard to believe he would have done it completely solo, isn't it?
Oh, well, I think so. And it is an interesting note. I mean, if we're assuming that this truly is Munkin, who, by the way, must have been incredibly old when Baelor died, if he was already Grand Maester for Aegon III before he reached his majority, we're talking about a very old man. But also, I kind of noticed that as I was sort of rereading for this episode, is that Munkin, did what he could to save the king. In my mind, putting that together with how Munkin felt about Aegon's sisters not being, or in Munkin's mind, not being worthy to be his heirs, I'm thinking Munkin may have thought, oh, no, if the king dies and his sisters are possible next candidates, I can't allow that to happen. I'd much rather have Viserys in line, sort of this strong executive figure who'd been serving his hand for so long. So I don't know, maybe I'm just cynical, but when I read Munkin did what he could to save the king, I'm kind of thinking about, when Tyrion confronts Pycelle and Pycelle says, well, yeah, see, Jon Arryn was poisoned, but his maester was actually doing what he should be doing and trying to heal him. And I didn't want that to happen because Daeron very definitely knew about the parentage of the Baratheon children. So I made sure that he died. That's kind of what it sounded like when he said did what he could to save the king.
Yeah, it really does. And the boy High Septon doing what he could is, well, I'm sure that was, boy, yeah, it was probably a close call. That kid probably almost ruined all their plans with his, I don't know what exactly, his miracles on demand, but they weren't on demand that day.
I have to feel so bad for him. That kid just, like, this is a little 10-year-old off the streets, and all of a sudden he's in the middle of a gigantic political crisis.
Yeah, I don't think we hear about it, but did they just remove him as High Septon afterwards?
So this was something, and I think I actually got it wrong the last time. There's no note as to what happened to this child. Now, that being said, I have always headcanoned that he was quietly assassinated following Baelor's death, either by the most devout or by Viserys, and the most devout just simply accepted it. Again, we don't know this. There's no evidence of this. But in my mind, I think the most devout were like, yeah, we don't want a child ruling us. We can't deal with that. They don't know what they're doing. So, oh, shoot. It's so unfortunate. How awful that he just died in his sleep.
The Seven took him home. Maybe he declared that he would enter, a life of penance or something, after.
But Poochie died on the way back to his own planet.
That sort of thing, exactly. This definitely has shenanigans written all over it, for sure. We've been using Descript for 3 years now. To start, it was an audio editing tool. It provides a transcript that you can edit from directly. It's really neat. Instead of editing the waveform, you can simply cut words out, and Descript removes the corresponding portion of the track. Over these 3 years, Descript has continued to improve, becoming an invaluable part of our video editing toolkit. We use it to make captions, animated quotes like the ones in this episode. Unlike many other transcription tools, it allows you to add your own dictionary of words, so it actually recognizes words like Baelor and Nerys. Now, it's one thing for us to endorse a product we use personally, but I think it's an another level entirely to endorse something that we use for a living. Find it at get.descript.com/howdescript, or click the link in the description. Thanks to our Queen of Love and Beauty patron. From the depths of Fleabottom, Lord Ken of House Hammer has declared for Queen Carrie, Fire of the North, who recovered Dark Sister from beyond the wall. Succession. Whether Viserys had a hand, pun fully intended, in his nephew's death, he was certainly quick to take advantage of Baelor's passing.
Though both of the sons of King Aegon III were dead, his 3 daughters yet survived. And there were some amongst the small folk, and even some lords, who felt that the Iron Throne should by rights now pass to Princess Dana. They were few, however. A decade of isolation in the Maiden Vault had left Dana and her sisters without powerful allies, and memories of the woes that had befallen the realm when last a woman sat the Iron Throne were still fresh. Dana the Defiant was seen by many lords as being wild and unmanageable besides, and wanton as well. For a year earlier, she had given birth to a bastard son she named Daemon, whose sire she steadfastly refused to name. The precedents of the Great Council of 101 and the Dance of the Dragons were therefore cited, and the claims of Baelor's sisters were set aside. Instead, the crown passed to his uncle, the king's hand, Prince Viserys.
Perhaps the new King Viserys II had learned a few lessons from the outbreak of the dance. The Green faction had been physically present in the Red Keep and quick to meet as soon as Viserys I died to make a plan for Aegon II's accession. And it was pretty smooth. Rhaenyra was back on Dragonstone, only heard the news later, and was unable to do anything about it. Maybe Viserys wanted to do the same, seize the throne quickly at the moment the king was dead, and not allow anyone a chance to react to it and make things as smooth as possible, and in that, establish himself and have that be a point of strength. Ironically, despite the fact that Viserys and Baelor were almost certainly very opposed in a lot of ideologies, if not their entire ideologies, they were united in their unwillingness to give Baelor's sisters any political agency. it's possible Viserys even used Baelor's attitude towards his sisters to justify his taking of the throne, as well as his closeness to the king and being hand for so long. That is actually something of a fair argument, the fact that he had so much experience ruling. But and regardless of fairness, it certainly helped as well. Now, I would bet Viserys also took advantage of the lack of clarity. Of course, there was no succession, so as the hand, he's arguably the guy that gets to make the call more so than anyone else in the first place. So not only was he next in line, but he was the guy that got to make the call. And these are all things that would have been blatantly obvious to him, as well as to a lot of other people around him. But what could they do about it, right, Nina? Like, what could anyone have done to Viserys about this, given he had control of pretty much all of court?
And again, I think that that's why, whether or not Viserys actually killed Baelor, although again, I think he did, Viserys is quite literally best placed to take over at the moment of Baelor's death because he is right there. Viserys probably knows, the moment the king dies because he's hand. He's gonna be there if the king, we know obviously there's some level of trying to treat the king before he dies if Monken is treating him. Viserys is probably there as hand. He's probably watching this happen. So the moment the king breathes his last, Viserys can move immediately. And, his argument is not a bad one. He's the next male. He's the next closest male. He's been serving his hand for at least 2 decades, if not more. He is the most senior male of House Targaryen. He's very intelligent. He's widely seen as a ruling figure. So, yeah, in a way, it seemed pretty natural that the crown should just simply pass right to him. And I think it's an important point that, speed is everything. We see this so much in A Game of Thrones. When Robert dies, one of Ned's crucial mistakes is that he loses that opportunity to move immediately. What he needed to be doing is immediately saying, by the way, Robert's dead. I'm now regent and hand. Oh, and by the way, the Joffrey is not Robert's son and the rightful heir should be Stannis. He doesn't move immediately. And so what Ned finds is that when he tries to do this, Joffrey's already literally sitting the Iron Throne. He's already got that baked in. I think Viserys didn't make that mistake. I think he made sure to move quite quickly to consolidate his power so that the moment Dana or Rhaena or Elena figures it out, it's too late. They don't have any shot at making themselves, having a shot at becoming queen.
Legacy. It's a big one. It's a rich one. Baelor is highly memorable as an in-world figure, which makes him doubly or triply, given the number of episodes, interesting to us. Appropriately, we have 3 specific examples of people who are named after Baelor, and they have a nice variety to them. There's Baelor Breakspear, who, of course, was born not long before Baelor's death. He was born technically about maybe a matter of months, maybe as much as a year. It's not entirely clear, but he had been born. So that would have been one where Baelor might have actually eaten something that day, because that's something good. But maybe he still starves himself when he's giving thanks. I don't know. This guy, you never know. Then there's Baelor Blacktide, who is Ironborn, but worshipping of the Seven. So that family's a little different, or has at least some adherence to the Seven. They're a little different. But that's a story for another day. Baelor Hightower, a.k.a. Baelor Brightsmile, or Baelor Breakwind, is a current example. He's alive as well right now. I guess so is Baelor. Well, Baelor Blacktide was alive at the start of the series, but not so much anymore. He got drowned. And Baelor Hightower is of course still right now, and also might be killed by Euron, however. But until then, he's a good example because
if your name is Baelor, just avoid Euron entirely.
You should avoid Eurons. Yes, you should. But he is associated with the Hightower family, which of course, being a member of them, which is of course associated with the closeness to the Faith of the Seven and the former seat of the Faith. At least it was sometime around this time, maybe, or before the seat moved, which is not entirely clear. But as we'll discuss in a little bit, Baelor Sept is a big part of what really established the seat of the Faith in King's Landing instead of in Old Town. Now, of course, the tale of Baelor and the Dragon Knight and the Vipers is extremely memorable. That's the kind of thing people aren't going to forget easily. It's a great story, especially coming as it does in the non-dragon era of Targaryens. which is also more recent. So in some ways, it's more memorable because it's not quite as old as some of those other stories. It's a little easier to remember. Now, let's get back to our friends in A Song of Ice and Fire. This time, a bigger conversation. I love this one even more than the other one because it has even more voices. Tyrion, the Red Viper, Ilaria Sand, and Sansa all weighing in here. Quote,
"But Baelor the Blessed was a great king. He walked the Boneway barefoot to make peace with Dorne and rescued the Dragon Knight from a snake pit. The Vipers refused to strike him because he was so pure and holy." Prince Oberyn smiled.
"If you were a Viper, my lady, would you want to bite a bloodless stick like Baelor the Blessed? I'd sooner save my fangs for someone juicier."
"My prince is playing with you, Lady Sansa," said the woman, Ilaria Sand. "The Septons and singers like to say that the snakes did not bite Baelor, but the truth is very different. He was bitten 100 times and should have died from it." "If he had, Viserys would have reigned 12 years," said Tyrion, "and the 7 kingdoms might have been better served. Some believe Baelor was deranged by all that venom."
"Yes,"
said Prince Oberyn.
"but I've seen no snakes in this red keep of yours. So how do you account for Joffrey?" Gotta love that. 4 different opinions on Baelor there. Sansa has the version from stories and song. Of course, that's what you would expect from her. Highly sanitized version is kind of the point there. Oberyn just seems to doubt the whole thing. All of it seems like bull to him. He's like, yeah, I don't know about these Vipers. I don't know about this other thing. None of this stuff makes sense to me. He's very cynical about it, which is fair. I think that there's reasonable doubt for a lot of it. Ilaria says, actually, he was bitten, and that just makes it all the more impressive. Singers say he was bit 6 times. She's like, it had to have been more than that. She gives a much higher number. While Tyrion thinks the more competent ruler would have done smarter things all along and would not have been in a position that Baelor was. Vipers or no, like, whether it's impressive or not, what the hell's he doing in that pit? He's like, he shouldn't be testing himself in that way. That's not what kings should be doing. So he acknowledges that Baelor meant well, though, which I appreciate that. Tyrion has a very nuanced kind of, he's the only one of this group maybe that has a multifaceted opinion. Maybe if we had more time with them, they'd say other things. But he also, kind of like the Red Viper, doubts some of the more legendary elements. Like he's not willing to believe that the guy was actually bitten like 50 times. Like I don't think so. I don't know. Yeah, which again, that's a fair thing to question. I mean, right? Like 50 times being bitten and he didn't die. Okay, yeah, I do have a hard time believing that even in this setting. Then Oberyn brings up a very interesting question. I love this question. It's the question of what does madness really mean? He compares Baelor and the idea of madness to Joffrey and a different idea of madness, which is a provocative thing to say, yes, but it's a good point. Baelor and Joffrey are extreme opposites when it comes to violence, but they're both extremes, and they both have an argument to be made that there's madness there. What do you think about that, Nina?
I think we talked about this at the very, very, very beginning of this series. And one of the points that I really wanted to focus on when it came to Baelor is that Baelor is a character of extremes. And I said it before and I'll say it again. I mean extremes plural, because Baelor is very extreme in some ways in terms of, his peace and his commitment to piety and his commitment to the small folk. And in some ways, those are very good things. Some of the things he did, I think we can, accept as good and noble and worthy. But he is extreme in other ways. Again, at the end of his life, he's willing to go to war against his own people. He's willing to do that on the basis of religion. He's treating his sisters very poorly. He's treating a lot of women very poorly. So Baelor is a really difficult figure to get our hands around, in a way far more difficult than someone like a Joffrey. Joffrey is, simply put, a teenage sadist. He's someone who just enjoys pain and cruelty. There's not much depth of that when it comes to Joffrey. There's depth in terms of, his backstory and what happened and what his upbringing was like. But in terms of his personality, I think he's a lot more straightforward of a character versus a Baelor, who is someone that I think has a lot of facets to his personality. He is the same person who wants to empty the treasury constantly to make sure that his people have food and money. and doesn't want to wear finery because he believes that that's a waste of gold if it could be put in the hands of the people. And he's also someone who drives all the sex workers and their children out of King's Landing with nowhere to go and eventually wants to make war on his people. What do you do with a person like that? There's a lot of extremes there, and there's a lot to unpack with that.
Well said. Absolutely. Now, continuing on the theme of Baelor being highly remembered and name-dropped and cited, and a theme amongst that theme is that he's cited as the most you can do, like the maximum, the guy who exemplifies several different ideals more so than anyone else, which is why he gets name-dropped so often. For example, none other than Barristan the Bold. Quote,
"No ruler can make a people good," Selmy had told her. Baelor the Blessed prayed and fasted and built the Seven as splendid a temple as any gods could wish for. Yet he could not put an end to war and want.
The context of this quote is Dany taking on a lot of responsibility and taking on things that maybe she shouldn't or can't. And Barristan is very interesting because of the level of experience he brings to the table in this regard. Compare him to Viserys, who had the very difficult decision, arguably, of whether or not he had to murder his own nephew to take the throne. Someone like Barristan would have been not there at the time because this was a different era, but there would have been Kingsguard knights in a similar role who would have maybe been aware of this conflict without the burden of having to be the one to make that call. But Barristan would be a very good example of that, someone who was around for several kings and saw a lot of dilemmas and saw Aerys's descending madness and things like that. So he's a very unique perspective on this, a very learned and experienced perspective. And unlike Viserys, we actually get direct quotes from him. So there's that too. Now, there's also the character of Lancel. Now, as a person, a character in the story, he's maybe the best example, if not of someone who is holy and pious, but someone who becomes holy and pious, which isn't Baelor. Baelor was always like that. But in becoming a very holy/pious person, Lancel, of course, has a very positive view on Baelor, as he says here, going a lot farther than, say, a Barristan Selmy or even maybe a Daenerys. Quote,
"He was a rare spirit, pure and brave and innocent, untouched by all the evils of the world. I am a sinner with much and more to atone for."
That's a bit over the top, but again, this is the equivalent of a born again in this world, right? So he's very enthusiastic and effusive about his beliefs. They're fresh, they're new to him, and he's all about it. In the context for this case with Lancel, it's Jaime pointing out a very good point, which is there might not have been a Blackfire Rebellion if Baelor hadn't set aside his wife and actually had children with Dana the Defiant, rather than Dana the Defiant having a child with one of his other relatives. So that's it's not a bad point by Jaime, I gotta say. And Jaime is also a Kingsguard who has some very strong opinions on mad kings and such. Now, one day we'll have quotes from Blood and Fire, hopefully, which will give us even more context on Baelor, and that'll be great. But these quotes directly from George R. Martin, well, that's pretty good for now in terms of things that you might not be directly aware of, y'all. For example, this question, which is, why didn't Baelor the Blessed, the Septon King, rearm the faith?
Baelor the Blessed wasn't interested in arming anyone. He would have preferred to disarm the entire world. He was a man of peace, and his favorite weapon was a prayer.
Yeah, that checks out, doesn't it, Nina?
Yes and no. And I don't mean to disagree with the author on his own character.
Okay. Yeah, right on.
I'm
Let's
trying
go.
to do that. But I think there's a way in which there can be two truths at the same time here. I don't disagree. Obviously, Baelor is a man of peace. We know that because he literally walks hundreds of miles to Dorne to make a peace. So yes, 100% agreed on that aspect. But I think it is also worth considering he's not just a man of peace, because again, the end of his life, he's fully willing to go to war against his own people. So I don't think we can simply say, oh, man of peace, and that's the end of the story. I think for Baelor, why he didn't rearm the Faith, why he doesn't restart the Faith militant, kind of goes hand in hand with what you were saying in terms of Baelor essentially naming the High Septons, naming Pate the stone carver, and then, this young boy. I think Baelor saw himself as really the representative of the gods on Earth, that in a real way, he's the voice of the Seven, not the High Septon. It goes gods, then Baelor, then the Faith, then everybody else, and in that order. And so if that's the case, then maybe Baelor's thinking, why would I rearm the Faith? My armies are the armies of the Faith. If I tell someone to go somewhere, it's because I'm doing what the gods want. I don't need the Faith to separately run an army because I'm going to tell the Faith in the entire realm what the gods want, including if I need the army to go somewhere.
Now, there's that saying we are all familiar with, the Targaryens and madness and coin flips, all that. It might be exaggerated a bit because it's pretty hard to argue that actually half of the Targaryens have been mad. That's not quite that extreme. Even if you stretch it out a bit and loosen the definition of madness, it's hard to get there. But it's hard to argue as well that Baelor doesn't qualify. Like, you don't have to be loose with the definition of madness for that. But he kind of proves that you can't simplify it too much. As we've given with the examples of Aerys and maybe Maegor and some others, it's not so easy to always define what madness is in just that context. You have to include other factors like violence. And as Nina pointed out, even that isn't enough. Sometimes you have to have maybe separated intent to be violent versus policies that inevitably lead to it through naivete or insanity, in this case, since we're talking about madness. So there's that same argument that we have in the real world about the fine line between madness and greatness, which I think George is playing off of here. A lot of these Targaryens fall into that category. Certainly not half of them were great, just like not half of them were mad. But that's beside the point, which Barristan heard from Jaehaerys II, by the way, the coin flip thing. It shouldn't be implied that you can't be both mad and great, right? Aerys was mad, certainly. Great. Okay, he wasn't great, but he would be very, very memorable if he had actually succeeded in blowing up King's Landing. That would have been a quote-unquote great achievement, not a good thing to do, but like, wow, oh my God, that one of the things that would ring throughout history. I'm not sure Maegor was mad or great either, but there's some arguments for both. He's certainly remembered more than most, again, because of these extremes. His legacy includes a lot of things that are actually somewhat similar to Baelor, as we said before. And here's a new one, commissioning of buildings. That's something that Baelor and Maegor had a little bit in common of. Unlike Aerys, who nearly destroyed not just those buildings, but like everybody else and all the other buildings in the city. We're talking really important ones. Maegor's holdfast and his tunnels and the dragon pit, which, that thing's still around, though not in a completed state anymore. Baelor, he had ideas, and Aerys, well, remember Aerys, he had suggestions. He had, I want to build beyond the wall. Ooh, I want to build King's Landing on the other side of the river. He just had these ideas and gave them up. Baelor was more consistent, I'd say, even though his ideas were maybe just as crazy. He didn't just give up on them right away, I don't think. So these different types of madness, I think, are an interesting subtopic within all this amongst the Targaryens. Baelor, again, stands out as unique because of his dedication to peace, even if it was misguided at times. No other Targaryen really matches him in that regard, except for maybe like a Jaehaerys or something like that. What do you think in that comparison? Like a Jaehaerys to a Baelor, perhaps the one who's most famous for creating peace would be Jaehaerys, I think, and to someone who
or
like
I guess
a Baelor.
I guess a Daeron II is really
okay. Yeah, that's a good one, and Daeron being directly influenced by Baelor is a big point. So yeah, tell us what you think about maybe that triumvirate, maybe in Baelor being kind of in between them like that.
Well, I think and I was thinking about this quote about sort of the madness and greatness, and to your point. I don't find it a particularly useful paradigm to think about because, as you mentioned, it doesn't really feel applicable to most of the Targaryen kings. I mean, what do we do with a king like an Aenys or an Aerys the First. They're not bad or great, they're just bad at their job. They shouldn't be king in the first place. What do we do with someone like a Jaehaerys II? He's intelligent, but he doesn't reign very long. Is he mad? Is he great? I don't think he's either. I think he's just, maybe he would have been good if he had been in better health. I don't know. So, I don't really think about it in terms of a useful idea in that sense, in terms of, well, let's take our Targaryen king toys and we're going to put some of them in this box, we're going to put some of them in that box. But what I think it is useful for, in terms of thinking about this quote, is thinking about what I'm going to call, an extremely pretentious way, the great and terrible burden of being a Targaryen, and specifically being a Targaryen king. Because it's not just being king. It's not just being at the top of the political food chain in Westeros, having the most power, having the most authority, having the ability to command the lives and deaths of, tens of thousands or millions of subjects. That's all very true, obviously. But it's also being heir to this legacy of dragon lords that no one in Westeros, yes, there were many kings in Westeros before the conquest, but there was never a family of dragon lords before the conquest. And that's a level of supernatural power and authority that really no one can have an idea about. And really no one can say, oh, my family had a similar experience to that. It's a really unique history and legacy in this world, and specifically in Westeros. And the reason I bring it up here, the reason I think about that quote in that context, is because, again, and I've said it again and again and again, I'm going to keep saying it again and again, what we're looking at with Baelor is this first generation of Targaryens to be born after the dance. And so, in real time, what Baelor and his siblings and cousins are struggling with is this change in the conception of what it means to be a Targaryen that is happening in real time. When Baelor is born, there is still at least one dragon alive. And when Baelor dies, there are no more dragons. He lives to see the extinction of the creatures that made his family great and powerful in Valyria. What do you do when your parents' generation had dragons and rode dragons, and then the dragons are gone? How do you define yourself as a Targaryen and a Targaryen king after that? There's no precedent. Baelor and his siblings and cousins are writing the playbook in real time. And so I think it leaves Baelor, and again, along with Daeron, along with Aegon IV, along with the other Targaryens in this generation, caught in this sort of liminal place. They're wanting to live, I think, for better or for worse, in this grand scale of their Dragon Lord ancestors, but they don't have dragons. They don't have that power. They don't have that authority. They don't have that legacy. They just have the memory of this legacy. And so I think for Baelor, that's why I think of him as this character of extremes, because he's trying to wrestle with those extremes that are present in that legacy. He's trying to say, I want to rule with all of the power and all the authority and all the grand ideas of someone like a Jaehaerys the First. But I don't actually have a dragon to make those things happen, again, for better or worse. And so I'm trying to do that while struggling along as a dragon rider in a dragonless age. He's someone who believed what he was doing was for the good of the realm, who fully believed that he was the agent of the Seven on Earth, and who was not going to be gainsaid by anyone. No one could tell Baelor what to do.
Yeah, you see his older brother trying to perhaps reestablish Targaryen supremacy by conquering Dorne with men, whereas it had failed with dragons, and he almost pulled it off. And now his brother Baelor is turning to an entirely different form of power, which is the gods. And there's arguably nothing more powerful than that. They're the greatest authority. And this culminates in a new topic, a new subtopic, the idea of greatness, which is difficult to define, as we've discovered, along with the concept of madness. But some things are inarguably great just because, well, it's in the name. And I refer to our next subject, the Great Sept of Baelor. Now, if you live in King's Landing or visit it frequently, Baelor's going to be on your mind a lot because this sept is huge and it's loud. The bells are going to ring every day. I mean, you get daily reminders of this guy. Not only did his actual deeds during his life ring out and are still remembered, but you have this backing that up. That's a huge thing. And it's literally a huge thing. The Great Sept is named so because it's immense. It's, like I said, it's harder to apply to people, but this is a monstrous building. It's completely fair to call it great. It's like arguing that Gregor Clegane isn't a large human. That's silly. It's definitely true. So it's also called Baelor's Sept. It's got a lot of nicknames. This is where, again, we get back to Baelor and Maegor having some similarity. Pacifist versus warmonger, yes. Maegor fought against the faith while Baelor upheld it more than anybody ever else. They both thought very big when it came to building. You got the Dragon Pit, basically the largest building in the land, until this came along, which is the biggest of its kind ever. So you got a giant house of dragons, a giant house of the seven. Similar concepts. One is the thing outside of their humanity that they claim to give them authority over everyone else, whether it's dragons, whether it's the gods. Yeah, that's kind of it in a nutshell, isn't it?
Well, it is. And it's sort of this, it goes, what I was saying before, this sort of perfect dichotomy of Baelor, where on the one hand, I think that Baelor genuinely believes that the reason there are no more dragons is because the gods were angry with the Targaryens because of their incest, that the gods were angry that the Targaryens were promoting the doctrine of exceptionalism using the dragons, and so decided to get rid of the dragons to punish the Targaryens. So on the one hand, the Great Sept of Baelor is the answer to the Dragon Pit. It's saying, no, I'm rejecting the Dragon Pit. On the opposite hill, I am going to build the greatest temple to the faith in the whole land. I'm going to show in brick and mortar and stone, I am worshiping the seven now. We are rededicating the realm, not to the dragons, but to the seven. And yet, Baelor doesn't get rid of the Dragon Pit. Now, maybe practically he couldn't have. I don't know how practical it would have been to try to get rid of it. But he doesn't get rid of it. And again, we know that Baelor does try to hatch dragons at some point. So I think there is still this wrestling with this legacy of, well, the seven got rid of our dragons because they were mad and we have to rededicate ourselves, but we are still Targaryens, so we do still like those dragons and the memory of those dragons. So we're gonna leave the Dragon Pit as sort of that legacy to there and just leave it as is. It's the dichotomy in building form.
I love that idea of Baelor because he prays over the dragon's eggs, like you say. That is kind of a strange, hard thing to parse there because they don't exactly fit. But of course, he's a conflicted guy on some ways, not when it comes to the faith. But if he's like, well, if the gods say it's okay, then it's okay. So I'm going to ask them. I'll just pray over the eggs, and if they hatch, then clearly the gods are cool with it. So why? There's no harm in asking, right? Another funny thing these two have in common is that these huge projects that they started, neither of them lived to see them completed. This isn't that unusual for large-scale building projects in a medieval-ish type setting because, I don't know about the Dragon Pit. There's maybe not a lot of real-world comparisons we can make to that so easily. Maybe there are as an architect. As a non-architect, rather, I don't really know where to start with that. It's a little easier with the Sept because it's a lot like a real-life cathedral, isn't it, Nina? Which we have lots of examples of, and those take a long time to build, don't they?
Well, they do. And the thing is with this, I tend to think that the Sept was completed or mostly completed by about 187 because this is when Daeron II and Meryn Martell ride the Great Sept. They lay this wreath at the foot of Baelor's statue. I'm guessing that means the Sept was more or less done at this point, which might seem like a really short amount of time if we're thinking of something along the lines of, I don't know, insert any given medieval cathedral here, and this is built in, the better part of 17, 20 years. That's a really short time frame, but I don't really care because in this sense, I don't really care if George R. R. Martin sort of cheats the timeline because it works narratively in terms of what he wants to accomplish. Daeron is Baelor's spiritual successor in every meaning of the word. And I think you need Daeron to be the one who sees the completion of this, because he is also seeing the completion of Baelor's political legacy, which is this peace with Dorne. So, yeah, is it cheating the timeline a little? Maybe. Do I care? Not really.
We can argue it was like a Return of the Jedi situation where it wasn't fully completed, but that thing was operational. Like, they can still have weddings and ceremonies in it, even if they're still painting the windows or installing filigree on the archways, or I'm coming up with terms. I don't even know what I'm saying here.
They're laying the bricks as the horses are walking over.
Absolutely, yeah. So who knows? Or maybe the smith actually did answer some prayers and come down and just like get to work.
You know what?
Know.
Maybe that child Septon actually could talk to the gods.
Ooh.
Maybe that's what happened.
He was a stonemason. And there's that stonemason one, right? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
so,
you know what? That's what it was.
It all adds up, actually. We solved it. But if we fast forward to story in current times, meaning A Song of Ice and Fire, well past Daeron and these other characters who inherited Baelor's legacy, this is where Ned was executed. Quote,
"Let the High Septon and Baelor the Beloved and the Seven bear witness to the truth of what I say. Joffrey Baratheon is the one true heir to the Iron Throne, and by the grace of all the gods, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms and Protector of the Realm."
This was a big problem for the Faith afterwards. Like, Ned said what he had to say, and Joffrey had his head cut off anyway. But you're not supposed to be killing people in front of Baelor. I mean, the whole, look what we just got through talking about what the man stands for. He's not a place of, this is not a place for blood and executions. This is a place for peace and contemplation and joinings and alliances and marriages and, positive things, uplifting things, not death. So you can see already what George was doing with that scene and having it be not just Joffrey and perhaps Littlefinger pushing him into it, trampling on this carefully laid plan of that several people were involved in, but also just ignoring an important political consideration, which is the happiness of the faith and the High Septon and the most devout. They're a very important political body. And Joffrey didn't think about them even for a second. So Cersei also began her walk of shame there, which is maybe also not so in line with positive things. And under the High Sparrow, maybe we see more of these punishments and things that are also maybe not what Baelor had in mind. Baelor, we don't hear about him really torturing people or inflicting punishment. He inflicted it on himself, but I don't know. How do you feel about this in terms of torture and punishment as a device that's used by certain rulers or leaders under the guise of being faithful vis-a-vis Baelor? I don't think we've really talked about that specifically.
I don't know how much Baelor would have looked at or would have used it. Certainly that's not what comes down in the popular imagination, but at the same time, if we look at the High Sparrow as someone who very clearly takes Baelor as an inspiration, very clearly thinks of himself as, inspired by Baelor, I don't know that it would have been that far away. Obviously, Baelor is, punishing himself very severely and very physically for, what he believes are his sins or the sins of the realm. But Baelor also does a lot of things that I'm not sure are that far away from what we see happen under the High Sparrow in, say, A Feast for Crows or Dance with Dragons. We see him, again, he literally imprisons his sisters for the better part of 10 years. I don't know how comfortable the Maiden Vault was or wasn't, or what they were subject to on any given day in the Maiden Vault, but at the very least, they're not free to go, which is already a form of, unwilling imprisonment. He's also promoting the use of chastity belts, which, again, we talked about are not a real historical thing, but in the context of this universe, are not a nice thing to put on girls and women. And he's promoting that actively. And he's also not afraid to make his courtiers perform public acts of service that they don't want to do. Now, again, I'm not saying that that's torture, but he's certainly not afraid to make people do things that he believes they need to do that they themselves would never do because he believes that's what the gods want.
Absolutely. I think that's very true. And it's easy to frame it if you think about what we discussed very early on in the series, which is that Baelor puts faith above everything else. Yes, he's a man of peace, but he puts faith even higher than that. And if he believes that pain or suffering is purifying in certain cases or brings you closer to the gods, then that's worth it. He won't think of it as cruel, even if someone is suffering, if he believes the end result is holiness or a positive connection to the greater above, the seven themselves or something like that. So yeah, you can see how it could be justified in a lot of cases, given that he was willing to do things like kick all the sex workers out. That's inflicting punishment on them. Maybe he's too naive to think that they'll suffer, but the rest of us can pretty easily see that would be more than an ordeal. They're effectively refugees with almost nowhere to go and are extremely vulnerable. So that's a big deal. Now, what do we think about the idea that the Sept will be destroyed? Because it would be rather symbolic. It doesn't have to be the same circumstances as the TV show, obviously. It could be very different, but the Pyromancers Guild is below it in the tunnel, so it is located kind of conveniently for a conflagration to happen. We've already got Cersei messing with the forces like that. Again, the parallel to Ares. We've gotten multiple examples of caches of wildfire that weren't discovered, that were left behind, that Jaime didn't find or the other guys didn't find. So there's a lot of possibility here. It would be kind of interesting to have the most peaceful king, to have his greatest work or most standing monument, the thing that he's most remembered for, just fiery destruction. That would be pretty meaningful and symbolic, maybe the kind of thing George wants to do. What do you think?
Oh, 100%. I mean, I have said it for a long time, and I will continue saying it. I very firmly believe that the entirety of King's Landing, including the Great Sept of Baelor, is going to be blown up. And it is going to be blown up in something close to an atomic explosion, thanks to all of this wildfire, and it's going to be set off not intentionally, to be clear, to be absolutely clear, not intentionally, but it's going to be set off by Dany with her dragon. And I think why that works narratively for me is because, again, I do not at all think this is going to be intentional on Dany's part. She obviously doesn't know that this exists. But I think what is going to horrify her about this and just utterly, really, really deeply affect her is that not only are all of these people, suffering and dying, which is obviously going to affect her very, very deeply, but also this is her family's legacy. This is the city that her ancestor Aegon the Conqueror built. This is his city with his castle, with his Iron Throne. She's blown it up. And now this is Baelor's Sept. This is his legacy. This is his grand monument to the gods blown up. And I genuinely believe that this is going to be a really deeply affecting moment where Dany thinks, is this who I am? Is this all I can do? Is just destroy everything that I ostensibly hold to? Now, again, I think she's going to have a heroic arc in the end, but I think that is going to be a moment in probably a Dream of Spring.
Yeah, I could really see that. She wouldn't be targeting that building. There'd be no reason to, but oops, and then people would blame it on her, the person that maybe had brought some of the fire there in the first place. Seems very possible. And to back the idea up, we even have Jaime thinking of when he's kind of reminiscing, for lack of a better word, on the wildfire plot. Beneath Baelor's Sept was absolutely one of the places where it was planted. So all we have to have is one of these caches being missed, which, as I just said a minute ago, there's 2 examples of caches being discovered during the time of the books alone. So there's been 17 years between. So yeah, In Brienne's first chapter, she meets this group of worshippers who are bringing bones to Blessed Baelor, his Sept, the Sept we've just discussed, of course. In the group is the future High Sparrow. This is right before he takes power. He actually calms his followers when they grow angry because they're like, hey, why don't you join us? We could use your help. And they're like, no, we got places to go. We're not going that way. And some of them get kind of angry. They're like, hey, they already are a little uppity. They're already kind of, wielding their new power a little inappropriately. But to his credit, the High Sparrow calms them down. But obviously, maybe power seems to have already gone to his head because this is before he's installed. And he does give off some Baelor vibes, as we said, in terms of his humble bearing and being very commoner focused, and seemingly that's who matters most, and keeping his eye on the gods for most of all. But it's a very violent man. He's different in that regard. Baelor, even if Baelor's memory is sanitized a bit, we don't have, I think it's pretty safe to say, the book version of the High Sparrow is willing to go a lot farther. I mean, the torture we've seen, the words he's spoken, Would you agree with that?
I'm still holding out that there may be more to Baelor, and he may be, more violent up into, this actual declaration of war against his own people that we don't know about. I don't know. I think that there's ways in which the High Sparrow and Baelor may not have been particularly different men, because I think, the one thing that we can say about the High Sparrow, I don't believe that he's a charlatan. I don't believe that he's someone who's just pretending to be pious just because he wants power. I think he genuinely believes everything he is saying, that he genuinely believes he is the agent of the gods, he knows what the gods want, and he's going to put that into practice, and everything he is doing is for what he believes is, the will and the benefit of the gods. Whether or not, you agree with that is a completely separate point, but I don't believe that he's a hypocrite. I don't believe that he's a charlatan. I don't believe that he's making it up. And similar with Baelor, I think Baelor very, very, very genuinely believed everything he was doing, and that everything he did was justified because he was doing it for the will of the gods.
Let's move on to our next section. De facto saint. So he's the prime example for several virtues, as we said, and that makes him maybe the in-world equivalent of a concept that doesn't necessarily exist in Westeros, but one that we kind of understand. Now, here's a particular example of that, the concept this time being abstinence, and our example is the soiled knight, Sir Aris Oakheart, right here.
Sir Aris heard faint music drifting through louvered windows as he passed below, and somewhere finger drums were beating out the quick rhythm of a spear dance, giving the night a pulse. Where 3 alleys met beneath the second of the winding walls, a pillow girl called down from a balcony. She was dressed in jewels and oil. He took a look at her, hunched his shoulders, and pushed on into the teeth of the wind. We men are so weak, our bodies betray even the noblest of us. He thought of King Baelor the Blessed, who would fast to the point of fainting to tame the lusts that shamed him. Must he do the same?
Another example of a person just thinking of Baelor as the example of being shamed by lust and how he went to extremes to manage that. And this is really difficult. You think of Baelor as the prime example, and realizing that, even he couldn't succeed. Even Baelor couldn't tame his own lusts. What a thing to have to realize and believe in. The most pious and holy guy, even he couldn't control his thoughts like that. So that might be sort of a, well, what the hell are you supposed to do kind of realization for some people like apparently Sir Aris Oakheart, who's having these thoughts in this moment. If Baelor can't do it, then what chance do I have? Maybe that's part of why he just gives in. From another angle, one might argue that, fasting didn't work, or it worked in the sense that being extremely sick and weak works, but that's no way to live. And it's certainly not an example that a common person can follow, or a Kingsguard knight who cannot be extremely sick and weak. That's not going to work for that job description. You can't spend all day praying and fasting if you have a king to guard, or if you're a peasant that has to work the land. So in a sense, that's his example is just beyond everyone else, which is part of the point. This is a king that takes responsibility for, or took responsibility for, the soul of his nation by doing things that no one else could. His holiness was meant to be unmatched. That's part of the point. It isn't just something to strive for. It's something you can't reach. Who could be Baelor except Baelor? So it's interesting to think about, they don't have the concept of sainthood, but he really is, in all ways, basically that without the word for it, isn't he?
Yeah, and it is interesting because you're right. The Faith of Seven doesn't have saints. They don't have specific holy figures, and yet there is Baelor. And I think you make an interesting and a good point there in that Baelor's legacy is almost one of, purposeful inability to reach it. You can't actually ever become Baelor. You can only strive to be Baelor. Whatever Baelor actually was in life, in death and in legacy, he's so much more than that. He's so much more elevated above, what the Westeros characters might call the common run of men. And that's reflected in the way that he's remembered. We basically never hear about Baelor except when he's called Baelor the Blessed, Baelor the Beloved, the Septon King, Blessed Baelor, Beloved Baelor. He has these epithets that are almost more important than him becoming king. It's not just that he was in the role of Targaryen kings. He is the saintly Targaryen king. He's the holy Targaryen king. He is the king who is remembered for his piety above all else. And so Baelor becomes this model of, again, what we'll call de facto sainthood. He is something for all faithful to try to attain, even more so than he is an example for, say, any given king or Targaryen kings.
And even Cersei is like, you gotta hand it to him. Even with all her anger and cynicism and all that, she has gotta hand it to him. You know, she gives him the little mental grudging hat tip there. Now, do we think Baelor's piety it had a positive effect on the behavior of the average Westerosi peasant and or noble? Is that something we can judge or say is tangible enough, or is that just kind of too hard to gauge?
I think it's a little too hard, and part of this problem, I think, is the way in which George R. R. Martin sort of writes characters who practice the faith, because what I've noticed, at least, when it comes to characters who practice the faith, they basically fall into one of three buckets. You're either a cynic who doesn't believe any of it and thinks it's all made up and lies and foolishness, or, yeah, you worship the faith, but it really doesn't have anything to do with your story or your narrative or your character. You maybe interact with it once and that's about it. Or you're a zealot and the only thing you think about is the faith of the Seven, and you are solely motivated by what you can do for the faith of the Seven. And there's really no crossover to any of those buckets. So I really wish that we had a little bit more world building in terms of popular piety. What does popular piety look like in Westeros, and how has the legacy of Baelor affected that? But at the same time, I do think there is a way, and, you know, we talk about it. Baelor is basically the saint of the faith. He is the figure that everyone can look to, the one specific, historically verifiable figure that everyone can look to and say, yep, that's who we should be. That's who we should be trying to attain. That's who we should be modeling ourselves after. It's Baelor the Blessed. It's Baelor the Beloved. It's someone who worshipped the gods and loved the gods so much. That's who we need to model ourselves on.
Let's return to our conversation between our very cynical and our very non-cynical Lannisters, Lancel and Jaime. Quote,
"Each night I make my bed beneath a different altar, and the Seven send me visions." Baelor the Blessed once had visions too, especially when he was fasting.
"How long has it been since you've eaten?"
"My faith is all the nourishment I need."
Again, Jaime has experience with this whole Mad King genre. He's not going to fall for the old starvation visions or from the gods trick. He knows starvation visions come from starvation. Jaime, as a knight, has stood vigil a few times. Beyond his experience with Aerys, who was mad for reasons that had nothing to do with food, he stood vigil when he was newly knighted and when his father died. That was a crazy 7-day experience. So he knows what it's like to have some deprivation. He has personal experience with it. Not in the same type that Baelor and Lancel have gone through, but this is a guy who knows what it's like. He's been in the field. He's been there, done that. And we're also pretty sure he's seen at least a vision or two. If you count dreams, it's definitely a few. If not, there's at least that one time where he sees his mother, which, well, he wasn't starving during that, but it was, yeah, that was something. It's outside.
Don't tell Baelor that was on a weirwood stump, by the way. He would just absolutely have a heart attack with that.
He would not like that. He's like, kick that guy out of the King's Guard. Yeah, he doesn't belong anymore. But Jaime, I think it's fair to say Jaime actually he doesn't say it, but through his words, reading between the lines, he kind of respects Lancel a bit, despite everything, because he's got this faith and loyalty, and Jaime is so cynical. He wants to be devoted and loyal. That's the life he thought he was going to have, and that's the world he wants to live in. And Lancel is living in that world, even if it's, in Jaime's mind, fabricated. So I think that's kind of an interesting dynamic between those two. Now, we have a real-life example here, or a sort of real-life / semi-fictionalized account version here that I think is a lot of fun. Nina, take us away.
I've got the real-life example, but then I've also got the semi-fictional example, so I'll do both. You get both. So, Louis the Ninth, we talked about him a little bit in the last episode as a possible inspiration for Baelor, and as someone who the author has specifically noted is an inspiration for Baelor. Louis IX obviously was a real historical figure, and he was really canonized. He was, in fact, the only king of France to ever be canonized. But he's not just a real historical figure. He's also sort of a character in The Accursed Kings. And obviously I'm going to use every time I'm on the show to talk about The Accursed Kings, because that's who I am. He's not a character in the sense that he's on page, because he's dead by the time the books start, but he is an important historical figure. And what I think is so notable when we think about George R. R. Martin being influenced by Louis IX and also being influenced by The Accursed Kings in writing Baelor is that the way that Maurice Daeron, the author of The Accursed Kings, writes Louis IX, it's very similar to how George R. R. Martin writes Baelor in some ways. We basically, when you're reading The Accursed Kings, Louis IX is almost never referred to as Louis IX. I think there is literally one time in all of the books that he's referred to as Louis IX. Every other time, he is either Saint Louis or the King Saint. That's how he is referred to. It is inescapable, that definition. He is king and saint at the same time. And when the author, Maurice Daeron, is describing him, he calls him the canonized king, the defender of Christendom. And, we are introduced in the fourth book to one of his daughters, Louis IX's daughters, Agnes. Maurice Daeron literally describes her as anyone who had seen him, meaning Louis IX, had been spoken to by him or been the object of his affection was endued with an almost sacred quality. This is a character that figures in this universe are literally praying to for intercession. The first chapter of the books, when we're introduced to Queen Isabella and she finds out that her son, Prince Edward, the future Edward III, has started talking, the first thing she says is, make sure you teach him the prayer to Monsieur St. Louis. She wants to make sure that he is remembered as this canonized ancestor figure of hers, as much as he's remembered as a king. And he's still venerated in this world. His tomb has pride of place at Saint Denis, at the royal necropolis, even though Maurice Daeron sort of adds this wry line that there are so many relics around purporting to be St. Louis that if you would put them all together, he would have doubled in size since his death. The implication obviously being that a lot of people are just saying that they have relics of him that are not actually relics. But I think it goes to show that when we're reading The Accursed Kings and we're reading about Louis IX, this is very clearly, I think, giving inspiration to George R. R. Martin for Baelor, how he's writing Baelor as this figure who is as much, if not more so, saint as much as he is king. Now, again, that's a semi-fictional portrayal. But real world, we can also look to Henry VI. We mentioned Henry VI of England as another possible inspiration for Baelor. And I think there is a real way in which George R. R. Martin may look to this legacy and this pseudo-saintly legacy of Henry VI as inspiration for Baelor. Henry VI was never canonized, not for lack of trying, I should say, because his nephew Henry VII did try to get him canonized when he became king. Papacy didn't go for it, mostly because he had been murdered for political reasons and not as a martyr, and that really just didn't really add to his sort of saintly argument. But despite the fact that he never actually had the title of saint, Henry VI was treated almost immediately after his death as a saint in all but name. So pilgrims are coming to his tomb. Many, many pilgrims are coming to his tomb in the years after his death and praying for his intercession. He is being referred to as Holy King Henry by contemporaries. It's this sort of strange amnesia where everyone just kind of forgot that he was a terrible king and not good at all for England, and just remembered him as pious and gentle and loving and kind to his wife and faithful to his wife. And they said, yeah, this guy was a saint. So they're going to his tomb and they're praying for his intercession, and they're leaving relics of what they believe that he had interceded for them. There's a story of people are wearing his hat because they believe that he can intercede to cure their headaches. And I think there's another story where someone was choking and they said, oh, well, Holy King Henry reached into my throat and took out what was choking me. And so I'm going to go to his tomb and thank him for that. So in a real way, for basically half a century after his death, he's treated as a saint. Now, that goes away because, unfortunately, his grandnephew and namesake, Henry VIII, puts an end to that. But I think that's also a way in which we can look at inspiration for Baelor, is a way in which, yes, he's not a saint formally, but he is looked to as a very, very holy figure in his time.
Right on. One final in-world example from a POV character, and it's a unique-ish POV character, and I mean Davos, and what makes him unique in this case is, and in a lot of cases, is that he is a noble who was raised up from a common-born person. So his opinion of Baelor would be a little bit different, as Baelor was particularly popular amongst the commons, and remains that way. So here is the case where Stannis tells Sir Axel to share his plan with Davos. Quote,
Sir Axel turned to Davos with a look on his face much like the look that proud Lord Belgrave must have worn the day King Baelor the Blessed had commanded him to wash the beggar's ulcerous feet. Nonetheless, he obeyed.
So Sir Axel is compared to a proud man brought low. Humility of sorts. This is a very ubiquitous type tale. Would be familiar to a lot of people, a lot of different settings, a lot of different religious upbringings. So it's the prime example, again, is Baelor here. If someone, when you think of humility or bringing someone low for pride, it's Baelor. That's who comes to mind for Davos. So that's really neat. I want to throw that one out there, too. And there's just so many more common folk than nobles. If you think about the sheer number of people that think of Baelor as the best king ever, in terms of numbers, in terms of popularity, he's probably got that going for him.
Well, and Davos is also someone who very much believes in the faith. He's a faithful, for lack of a better term, follower of the Seven. And so I think that, I'd be really curious as to, Davos's upbringing. He's not a zealot in terms of, he's going to give up everything to go join the faith militant now, but I think he is someone who does genuinely believe in the Seven, and so probably grew up thinking of Baelor really in this way, as a saint in all but name, as a holy figure of someone to look to. And maybe that adds to that feeling of when he sees Axel's face, he's thinking of these sort of pious morality tales with Baelor of, oh, this is another thing that holy King Baelor did to, humble the proud.
And of course, Davos being kept out of the old boys club is a running theme, and mixing it in with faith here is very interesting as a point of pride and a way to humble him and a way to mix all into Davos' story. These are themes that are very part of, especially his early story, which is what we're seeing here. Now, here's a subject that's particularly interesting because it both infuriates the modern mind, would also personally upset George if it were real, and you could tell a lot by him writing it in the first place, but would not be such a big deal to in-world commoners. So we would differ on that, I think, a lot here, and that's what makes it so interesting, and that is book burnings. We talked about this a little bit in part 2 when the book burnings were happening, but it's the long-term impact of the burnings, the legacy of all that lost knowledge is where the impact is really felt. It's not something that plays out over the course of a few years. You might not even notice the difference over a few years from a societal standpoint. We're talking about education and knowledge, things that don't by nature move quickly, especially on a big scale, which is what we're talking about. This is the very definition of something that plays out over the long term. Quote,
one unfortunate aspect of King Baelor's zealotry was his insistence on burning books. Though some books might hold little that is worth knowing, and some might even hold matter that is dangerous, destroying knowledge is a painful thing. That Baelor had the testimony of mushroom burned is no great surprise, given its ribald and scandalous content. But Septon Barth's unnatural history, however mistaken some of its proposals, was the work of one of the brightest minds in the Seven Kingdoms. Barth's study and alleged practice of the higher arts proved enough to win Baelor's enmity and the destruction of his work, even though unnatural history contains much that is neither controversial nor wicked. It is only fortunate that fragments have survived, so that the lore within was not wholly lost.
Yeah, George knew what he was doing here. This is a guy that's probably even more horrified than the average reader at the concept of mass book burnings. He knows this is a thing associated with some of the worst regimes of all time. The Nazis. I'll go all Godwin's Law here and bring them up. They burned a lot of books, and George was a young man not long after this happened. So it was both fresh in the history of the recent history of his own life and world history when he was a young man. They actually called it a cleansing by fire. Not only did the Nazis burn books in Germany and Austria where they took power initially, but they did it in captured territory, especially Poland, where they burned, and this is not an exaggeration as far as I know, millions of books. More than 75% of school and scientific libraries were burned. The Nazis were, of course, quite guilty of unqualified genocide as well, but this is cultural genocide. So Baelor never went that far, but if we go back to what Viserys was worried about, it is something along this level, which is maybe not like calling to mind real-world examples, but something like that in his setting where things escalate and you've got worshippers of the Seven killing people for owning a particular book or just for, I don't know, owning a piece of weirwood or something crazy. That's kind of maybe a bit far-fetched, but it's not out of the realm of possibility, and it might have been what was, and possible or not, it might have been what was on Viserys' mind. So it's fair to imagine that sort of scenario, or to imagine him imagining that, right?
Oh, no, absolutely. And I mean, how far-fetched is it when during the Andal invasion, there are Andal invaders who are chopping down weirwood trees? I mean, it's not that far to chop down a weirwood tree to chop down the people who are worshipping at the weirwood tree. So I don't think it's that far, and I think that is something that may have been worried about. Not necessarily the book burnings vis-a-vis the old gods, because I don't know how much written text there was with respect to that, or the Drowned God for that matter, but certainly the destruction of anything that Baelor deemed not in line with the Seven.
Right. It is obviously this wasn't just about books. These were in the general category of things offensive to the faith in his mind. You're absolutely right. Arguably even worse and more similar to Baelor and more recent in the 1970s was the Pol Pot regime, where he burned so many books. His idea was to make Cambodia great again by returning to the days where almost everyone was a farmer. Not only did they burn massive numbers of books, they killed people. They killed educated folk just for the sin of being educated, which is, again, the kind of thing Viserys may have been imagining in the proto-medieval version of all that. People who had valuable skills and knowledge, things that are a boon to the realm, killed for minor religious infractions, that sort of thing, or at least driven out. Maybe they're not killed. Maybe they just leave. Maybe they move out of Westeros because the climate is too dangerous for them. That is also what happened in Nazi Germany. You had German writers who weren't under any direct threat leaving. Well, they moved out of Germany because they're like, well, this isn't good. I can't trust that my books won't be next, etc. Viserys didn't stop the burnings as Hand of the King, but he might have slowed the progress or deceived Baelor about how thorough they were. I have headcanon that they lied to Baelor about a lot of things. Maybe not direct lies, like lying, like blunt to his face lies, but deceived him just to avoid certain topics, like kind of how they do with Cersei, things like that, for a different reason, but still just, if the leader isn't paying attention to that, we can get them to focus on something that's more important or keep them not distracted by this thing that shouldn't distract them. Now, and essentially if we look forward, I mean, yeah, he probably burned books on prophecy. Hopefully he didn't burn too many books that dealt with like medicine, astronomy might have been a problem for him. I don't know, that's the purview of the gods, and maybe he didn't like navigation handbooks or things like that. But think about like Ares the First, or even Rhaegar, who was quote unquote bookish to a fault. Like those guys found books at the Red Keep that led them on a prophetic path. So clearly either some of these books were reinserted into the library or were not burned in the first place. And that might be evidence of what I'm saying, that some books were just, they disappeared rather than being, Baelor was told they were burned, but they actually just went under someone's bed, for a while. It just makes sense, right? Like a lot of people the people who own the books are told to burn them. Are the maesters really going to be like, yes, sir, I'm going to burn all these? Or are they going to?
Well, and it's also, I mean, it's not like Baelor knows how many given copies of any given book are out there. There's no,
True.
There's no central depository of, oh, well, there are 1,000 copies of this book, or there are 7,000 copies of this book. If Baelor says, I want every copy destroyed, well, he has no practical way of knowing if that ever happened. And quite honestly, even if people wanted to follow what he said, who's even to say that they would have even been getting that message? I mean, someone could own a book who would never know that the king said that, depending on how far it trickled down the message getting to them. So I'm not really surprised that certain things would fall through, because Number one, not everyone is necessarily going to follow that. Number two, even if they want to follow that, they might not get the message. And number three, they may want to follow it and be foiled by people, internal to their organizations, families, whatever it may be.
Yeah. Now, one place where the real world analogy really fails is, again, amongst common folk. Like the level of literacy is hugely different in the real world, especially in the areas we discussed, versus Westeros, where their level of literacy is extremely low. So it's really hard for common folk in Westeros to care a lot about some of these books being burned. They have never read, owned, a lot of them would never have really seen a book in their life. Like actually, maybe a copy of the 7-Pointed Star, and that's it. Like that might be the only book a lot of them have ever seen in their entire life. And so it's hard for them to care, to be really outraged by that. Even if a lot of nobles or learned folk or maesters and archmaesters, they would care a lot. They're not going to really have the sympathy of the common folk in that. So it's one thing that enables it to, or enables us to imagine that it might have been worse in some ways than we imagined, because it wouldn't have been, the common folk wouldn't have stood up to that. And they may have even helped. They may have been like, yeah, burn those books. This is something that the nobles hold over us. It's an advantage they have that we can't have. So if they can't have it, then no one should have it, that kind of thing. They don't understand what's being lost. They don't understand what's being destroyed, etc., that kind of thing. So,
Well, it reminds me of two things. Number one, there's a sarcastic joke that Tyrion makes in A Dance with Dragons when he's aboard the ship, and he says that, he's looking for something to read, and he says, well, the captain, being an especially bookish captain, had 3 books. So it sort of goes to that books. Sort of joke of, Tyrion as an aristocrat, as among the highest circle of aristocrats in Westeros, he's used to having access to virtually as many books as he wants, or at least as would be readily accessible to him. Whereas someone who's even relatively well-to-do, like a captain of a ship, he's not necessarily interested in having more than 3 books, none of which are particularly academic in nature. But I think at the same time, there may also be the sense of, even among those who wouldn't necessarily have books or have a high rate of literacy, may still have veneration for the written word, because Tyrion also takes advantage of that with Mord at the Eyrie. He writes him a promise, and he's, when he does it, he says, is Mord one of these people who scorns literacy, or is he one of these people who venerates literacy because he's not? And he bets correctly that Mord is one of those people who says, I can't read, which means anyone who can read, I'm treating that as almost, I don't want to say almost magical, but something that is out of the realm of possibility for them and therefore of a higher status. So, it would be interesting to see what people would think about Baelor's order of book burning if they themselves don't own books or are not necessarily literate. Would they go along with it or not? I think you'd have a lot of different reactions.
One person who would either be for it or not care is Bronn, who told Podrick that books will ruin your sword eye. I didn't know a sword eye was a thing, but Bronn is an extremely good swordsman, and I'm not at all, so I won't argue with him on that one. So yeah, it would be really interesting. Like, that would be like a fun short story or a thing that could be written in Westeros one day about, how different institutions, different places handled the book burning. Like what happened in the Vale, the Reach, the Storm, like different places, how they handled it. Iron Islands, they don't care. They don't have any books to burn in the first place. No, I'm just kidding. The Reader is an example of, there are some books in the Iron Isles, but that's a place that could have probably just ignored it. Like, yeah, he's not going to find out. The Wall, they're like, yeah, he's not. They're not going to know. But other places where it's close by, the Riverlands, the Crown Lands, yeah, that could get really interesting. And story-wise, we could hear that he burned books that are relevant, like the Jade Compendium or Danis the Dreamer's Signs and Portents, or the Book of Lost Books. Maybe he's the reason the Book of Lost Books exists. Because he...
Yeah, how many entries in the Book of Lost Books are just like lost because of Baelor? Lost
yeah, right?
Because of Baelor. Last known copy in the reign of Baelor.
and we know that he had a few particular targets. For the most part, it's a little bit of an open question, but dragon lore seems to be one of the main casualties of this, which is interesting that burning would be the thing that caused the loss of dragon lore. Yeah. Now, here's a famous quote that we're looking at because it's a direct citing of Baelor's burnings.
What he really wanted was the complete text of the Fires of the Freehold, Galendro's History of Valyria. No complete copy was known to Westeros, however. Even the citadels lacked 27 scrolls. They must have a library in Old Volantis, surely. I may find a better copy there if I can find a way inside the black walls to the city's heart. He was less hopeful concerning Sept and Barth's dragons, worms, and wyverns, their unnatural history. Barth had been a blacksmith's son who rose to be king's hand during the reign of Jaehaerys the Conciliator. His enemies always claimed he was more sorcerer than Septon. Baelor the Blessed had ordered all Barth's writings destroyed when he came to the Iron Throne. 10 years ago, Tyrion had read a fragment of unnatural history that had eluded the blessed Baelor, but he doubted that any of Barth's work had found its way across the narrow sea. And, of course, there was even less chance of his coming on the fragmentary, anonymous, blood-soaked tome, sometimes called Blood and Fire, and sometimes The Death of Dragons, the only surviving copy of which was supposedly hidden away in a locked vault beneath the citadel.
Just Barth's reputation as quote-unquote sorcerer, as it's put there, would have irked Baelor. Whether he believed it or not, that's certainly a negative connotation. That's not the kind of thing that the faith would allow or sanction. Somehow he ignored that none other than Jaehaerys chose and honored Sept and Barth in that. So, hey, but Baelor went against lots of things that other good Targaryen kings did, so that's not too different. This is Baelor's conflict in a nutshell here. I guess the Citadel refused to burn that single copy of Death of Dragons, or maybe Baelor just didn't know about it, so he didn't order that one destroyed. Barth also comes up in Sam's POV as well, regarding Aemon and the princess that was promised and all that, so it's another example of perhaps Baelor having an impact on the story in that way. A book he didn't burn was called Dark Wings, Swift Words. It was actually written well after Baelor's reign by Archmaester Walgrave, which includes a passage about Baelor's attempt to replace ravens with doves, which is one of his more crazy notions. Just bizarre, and a good example of that guy was... It's hard to argue that guy wasn't at least a little insane, if not a lot.
That's a fun fact, by the way, and I just learned this because I was listening to a podcast the other week. This is not intentional burning, but the only surviving copy of Beowulf almost destroyed by fire in the 18th century.
Whoa!
Literally, there was one manuscript. Beowulf only survives because of one manuscript that was written, I think, in the 10th century and preserved for centuries afterward. And then there was a massive, massive, massive house fire where it was in the 18th century. And I believe, I may be getting the details of this wrong, but I believe it had super thick binding on it. And that was the reason that it survived. If that had been destroyed, we'd never know anything about Beowulf. There would be one entry in one catalog, and that's what we would know about Beowulf.
Wow.
So, things could be lost really easily.
Mixed political legacy. That says it all. It's very mixed, not only because the results were mixed, but because there's such mixed opinions on the impact of his reign and his policies and his legacy. You can't even find agreement in some circles on whether certain actions or policies had a good effect or what good even is. It gets very meta in some cases. And that's the nature, in some senses, of a man of extremes in charge. They're naturally going to majorly please some and deeply displease others, and that might be putting it mildly. One example, divorce. What examples did Baelor set by divorcing his own sister, which she was queen very briefly until he set her aside, which was after his walk. So she was queen for like a few months while he walked to Dorne. But what did this do? Did this reinforce or set any precedents that we can point to?
I mean, I don't know, if only because, and I think we mentioned this in the one of the other episodes, Baelor didn't make a unique argument, I will say, in terms of when he, called for an annulment of his marriage to Dana, because what he said was, number one, that he was underage, which is sort of an interesting argument, and I wonder how often that would come up, but number two, that it wasn't consummated. And we know that's a very valid argument in Westeros for putting a marriage aside. Incest or no incest when it comes to Westeros. If a marriage is not consummated, that's a really easy argument to put a marriage aside. So I'm not sure that Baelor was really, inventing new law or inventing new legal precedent when it comes to putting his marriage to Dana aside. That being said, I would be curious if this example were to come up in the future. Obviously, we see this a little bit, not quite explicitly, but certainly implicitly, when it comes to Lancel and his bride Amy, obviously taking inspiration from Baelor and Dana in terms of their personalities, and Lancel does end his marriage to Dana to join the warrior son. So there's a little bit of similarity to that, and he uses the same reason, which is that he didn't consummate the marriage. But the other point that it might come up is potentially with Sansa's upcoming marriage to Harry Harding. Obviously, she knows, and Littlefinger knows, that she was married to Tyrion, and they also know that this marriage wasn't consummated. So is someone, Sansa, Littlefinger, someone else in the Vale who knows, going to bring up the point, well, just like Baelor was able to put aside his marriage to Dana, so we can put aside this marriage? Maybe, maybe not. There's a lot of examples of it, but I would be curious if it would come up in the future.
Absolutely. And I think one way it might come up additionally, or not additionally, but within the context that you mentioned, is that because Baelor did it, it maybe is a little bit stronger because so many things he did ring out that because he did it, that makes it more okay. That solidifies it. I agree with you that he didn't establish that precedent, but he may have really firmed it up. And as you say here, there's some very specific examples. In fact, I wanted to mention the Lancel example. He absolutely does cite Baelor as a reason why his own marriage is invalid right here.
I said some words and gave her a red cloak, but only to please father. Marriage requires consummation. King Baelor was made to wed his sister Dana, but they never lived as man and wife, and he put her aside as soon as he was crowned.
So, yeah, it's very straightforward. Like you said, it comes up with Sansa and Tyrion, similar-ish reasons, very different potential consequences. I really wonder, too, what they think about Baelor and Dorne. You know, we don't have a lot of, as much as we get mentions of him, we don't actually have a lot of Dornish POV on him. Any thoughts on that? I mean, we're mostly guessing probably, but still, I'm curious what you think.
I'm super curious, and I would love to think that maybe Arianne in the future is gonna mention this, because obviously you can't talk about Baelor, and especially Baelor and Dorne, without talking about what Baelor set up, which is this idea of a peace and eventually a union between Dorne and the Iron Throne. Now, Baelor wasn't quite making that in his own lifetime. That was left to his spiritual successor, Daeron, to do. But what Baelor was starting to establish is the foundations of that, the beginnings of that connection. By walking to Dorne and making a peace, he's making it very obvious, I, as king on the Iron Throne, I don't want to conquer you. I'm not trying to make you an imperial province of the Iron Throne. I'm going to leave you as you are. But I'm not just going to leave you as you are, because I'm also going to create this marriage between Daeron and Princess Mariah. Now, whether or not Baelor thought of Daeron as his heir at that point, whether or not he was doing this because Mariah was at that point her father's heiress, I don't know. I don't know the details of that. But I think it's at least the beginnings of this legacy. And I think that would be hard for any given family or aristocrat in Dorne to ignore, is that, for better or worse, the beginnings of their union with the Iron Throne start not with Daeron II, they start with Baelor. They start with this marriage. They start with this idea that if not for Baelor, we don't get Daeron II. If not for Baelor, we don't get the union of Meryn and Daenerys. If not for Baelor, we don't get the fact that every Targaryen king after Daeron has Martell blood in them, and that every Martell prince and princess after Meryn has Targaryen blood in them. And there is this shared legacy that it all starts with Baelor. So I would have to think that in a large way, his influence is relatively positive in Dorne. Now, there may be pockets of families or individuals who don't believe that. I don't know what, for example, the Wills think of Baelor today, considering their ancestors were taking bets on his death. So, I don't know. I think it's probably a mixed legacy, but I would say probably overall pretty positive. And again, I'd be really curious if this is something that would come up vis-a-vis, say, Arianne and Aegon in The Winds of Winter.
Absolutely. And I'm very curious for that, too. I would love to learn more. It is fair, I agree with you, that we would call his legacy in terms of politics very mixed. Most of what he tried to do probably wasn't accomplished. Now, to be fair, maybe with more time he could have, but to be fair, he might have also just ruined more and made things a lot worse. That said, Dorne, the marriage and making it a at least semi-permanent part of the realm is a massive achievement, no doubt. Like, that's a big deal. The building of the Sept is pretty big, too. That's not necessarily a political achievement, but it is a big deal. So I do think that if we look at his overall impact, it's mostly in terms of culture and on the minds of common folk and how maybe people think and act rather than creating lasting political change, which, other than Dorne, which is a pretty darn big deal.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that, in a strange way, Baelor fails at almost everything except the thing which might have mattered to him most, which is being remembered for his piety. That is the thing that lasts about Baelor, is that everyone remembers that Baelor was the Septon king. Everyone remembers that Baelor was the pious king. And in a strange way, I think Baelor might have been happy with that. If he were remembered as the king who most loved the Seven, the king who was most remembered for his piety, maybe he'd be okay with that as a legacy. Maybe he'd say, you know what? That's what I wanted all along.
Right on. Despite 3 episodes on Baelor, there's a huge amount left unknown. I mean, a lot of what we discussed is theoretical. A lot of times when we discuss theoretical stuff, we have to go in a couple different directions to cover a lot of different bases. And if we were to learn just a couple more things, that might send us in entirely new directions. It might cancel out some of the ideas we've had. It might make us more confident in them. And there's a lot of hope, though, for more. I mean, it's not just something that we know that we won't get the answers to some things ever, but there's a very realistic expectation for quite a bit more here. Blood and Fire in particular, but also just Dunk and Egg in A Song of Ice and Fire. Given how many times Baelor has been mentioned to date in either of those, you would think that more is to come, especially given the plot lines like the Sept and Cersei and, like you said, Arianne and more, maybe. Who knows what else? Like, you could go name many more possibilities. So, yeah, there's a lot of possibilities for more. And don't you agree, Nina? I think there's a reason for optimism there.
1,000%. I mean, I mentioned or I hope I mentioned. If I didn't, I'm sorry, but there was an interview with George R. R. Martin and Dan Jones where he was talking about George R. R. Martin was talking about the future of Fire and Blood, Volume 2 or Blood and Fire, whatever he's going to call it. And he specifically mentions Baelor. He mentions Baelor by name. So clearly this is a character that he's going to write more about. Clearly this is a character he's excited to write more about. And I think there's very natural ways for Baelor to come up. You mentioned it yourself. There's literally a character named after Baelor that we're probably going to meet, or at the very least hear about via Sam in Old Town. There are characters in King's Landing who are being directly influenced by and referencing Baelor vis-a-vis the faith. There's reason to believe that Baelor will come in. Dany's going to land in Westeros at some point. She's going to have to interact with that legacy of her family. Baelor is an important part of that. We mentioned Sansa with putting aside her marriage to Tyrion, potentially marrying Harry Harding. Baelor could come up with that. And again, Dunk and Egg. Dunk and Egg are not that far away timeline-wise from Baelor, certainly closer than we are in the main series.
Oh, yeah.
So even though they're not necessarily interacting with anyone who knew Baelor, although actually I take that back because they might, depending on how old Elena was when she died, maybe they actually would be. And that would be great because if Elena is there, she knew Baelor. She interacted with Baelor. This is her brother. So it would be great to have someone who actually knew Baelor and could give stories about Baelor and her opinion on Baelor as he was. So I think there's a lot more to hear about Baelor, and I can't wait to see it. This is a character that George R. R. Martin clearly likes writing, and I can't wait to see what he does in the future for it.
We should just have a Dunk and Egg story where all it is Dunk and Egg sit at table and listen to stories about their ancestors told by some of their other ancestors. We'll take that. No actual adventure, no plot. They just hear a bunch of stories from that is the plot, those other stories. I'll take that. 4 or 5 stories contained within a story framework. Sure. Dunk and Egg don't do anything but listen, but we are entertained. I'll take that. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Nina. This was amazing. This series has been a super fun deep dive. We've had so much to talk about. It's been a lot of fun, both behind the scenes discussing these topics with you to kind of shape them into the podcast versions that we present here. And I'm just so glad we did it. Thanks so much for all your great takes and all your time.
Aw, well, thank you so much for having me. I love doing this. I'm eternally grateful to everyone who comes before me. I don't do this in a vacuum. I love, sharing my thoughts with you all. That's super fun to me. But also, I'm a creature of influence. So, I wouldn't be here without someone like the late great Stephen Atwell. He's a huge influence. And if you think I talk a lot about historical Targaryens, please go read his works because he was so great. And he's written, especially about Baelor. I wouldn't be doing these episodes. I also wouldn't be here without my loving husband as my live studio audience doing that too. So I have to give him a shout out too.
Shout out to James. That's right. And shout out to Steven as well. R.I.P. Steven. So we mentioned a few other episodes here that are relevant, but I also want y'all to check out goodqueenalley.tumblr.com where you can get more of Nina's thoughts. The latest post over there is a question about what the plan with Theon and marriage might have been in terms of Ned's plans. Would he have married him to one of his daughters?
The short answer is no.
Yeah, short answer is no. Yeah, but there is a little more to it than that. So
there is. That's the short answer. The long answer is my usual verbosity, but
yeah. So check that out and see for yourself. We also mentioned our episodes on Aemon the Dragon Knight, Daeron the First, the Young Dragon, Daeron the Second, which we actually did before we did Daeron the First. But really, we have a lot of Targaryen episodes, so I'll just leave the list at that because you can browse our back catalog and you will find quite a lot on House Targaryen.
But not everybody yet. We gotta do everybody. That's the thing.
It's true. We have not crossed off every list. You gotta catch them all. The Targaryens are like Pokemon. Sometimes they do evolve. Sometimes it's kind of terrifying. Sometimes it's a little cute. So, we're working on it. Thanks to everyone who supports us on Patreon and Spotify. We really appreciate the paid subscribers. That enables us to do this as frequently as we do. If not for y'all, we would do it a lot less often. We would have to have, spending our time doing like regular job stuff. And so we're very grateful that we can focus on this. Thanks to Joey Townsend for the original music that we use at the beginning, and Jesse Koval for the redone version, his cool version at the end. Thanks to Michael Klarfeld for the maps behind us. Extra special shout out to Michael, who at this time in real life is only about 48 hours from being here in Atlanta. His first trip to the U.S., we're going to show him a good time and hang out and do all sorts of fun American activities. USA, that's right.
You could have also had a live studio audience.
That's true. We're just a little short on that. Oh, no, he will be our live studio audience for our live stream on Sunday.
That's true. You know what? That's true. I take that back.
Let's thank those of you with titles on our Patreon supporters page by reading out those names. Our Hand of the King is a baseborn manjack, literally just a drunken spearman. Gods help us. Lord Jim the Fortuitous of the Wars and Politics of Ice and Fire blog is our Warden of the West. Cabeth the Unfrozen is Lord of the Bricks and Castle Crimson Light, Defender of the Old Gods and Warden of the North. Pirate Queen Carrie is a Storm of Secrets of the Sea, Captain Queen of Depth Feeder, which has sent countless ships to the bottom of the sea. Jenny the Just is captain of the ghost ship Liberty, which vanished in the Shivering Sea over a century ago, but has recently been sighted near Volantis, if the tales can be believed. Nevada Pike is Fourth of Frost, Frost Kraken, drowned in ice, commander of cats and krakens. Our small council includes Lord Chris B. of House Baelish, always keep your foes confused, Master of Whisperers. Drowned Dan, Lord of House Windsor, a master of karate, friendship for everyone, and ships. Lord Goodkill McGee is ruler of Castle Over Yonder and master of laws. And Grand Maester Scotty. Our lords and ladies in their castles include Lady Direliz of Castle Naki, the Alpha Patron. Gregor the Toasty, Lord of the Breadfort. The Bastard of the Wolfswood, First Forester of the Old Gods, sworn to House Ironwarewood. Listen for the silence. Lady Mora of House Stark, Archmistress of Apothecaries and Woodswitch. Her castle features weirwood doors with painted moons. Lena Snow is the Twilight Star, bastard daughter of Dane, wife of the Trickster and Lady of Castle Rivia. Aminda Pinkwolf is Lady and ruler of Castle Whitefast, the Ice Emboldens. Lord Benjen of House Hornwood. Lady Rebecca Stark of Castle Aurora is wielder of a weirwood bow with Valyrian steel-tipped arrows and friend of Shortround the Direwolf. Aurelian Matthias Resius is Lord of House Aurelian, ruler of Domus Aurelianus and the Valley of Tanasi, wielder of Sol Invictus, which might be Valyrian steel, and keeper of the largest collection of books outside the Citadel. We restore the world. Lord Daeron the Daring is wielder of the Valyrian steel sword Wisdom, Lord of House Hollingworth and the Hollyhold in Dorne, power in knowledge. Gabe the Jade Blade, whose foes are skewered and grilled. Lady Maria of House High Tree, Lady of Castle Fair Oak on the Crooked Lake. Sigil is a long grapevine with dark green leaves and purple grapes winding around a greystone pillar on a white field bordered by gold. Ever watchful. And Lord Abelard of House Harkonnen.
The Queen's High Council, Grand Archmaester Rennie, whose rod and ring and mask are quartz crystal, wielder of the Valyrian steel pen, fire and ink. Lady Wolfbird, mistress of the eastern rivers, gatekeeper of the northern skies, daughter of the silver sea, and master of coin. Devora Lynn Blackwood, maker of the frozen fury muscle bomb, eucalyptus and mint leaves, washed with Dornish peppers and sealed by fire ants, master of laws. Lady Jane of Driftmark, guardian of Dragonstone, the circling flame burns, master of ships. Lady Sonia of Sunspear, keeper of the Martell Menagerie, master of Castle Tormira Topanga, tame and keep well, master of whisperers.
Our Kingsguard includes Sir Dean the White, Knight of the Black Star, Sir Bateman the Dark Knight, Lady Annie, bringer of Winter's Warning, watcher in the werewood and bearer of wristwolves, Lord Jonathan of House Tanner, Lord Raydetto of House Avocado, protector of the royal kitchens, green in the morning, dark by evening, Lady Katie, cat herder of Tobean Terrace and royal feline advisor.
Our Queensguard is led by Lord Captain Commander Haema Helmonth, the Sellsword Sentinel, James the Green, Lord of the Meadows, keeper of the Trial of Grasses, Archmaester Vena, whose ring, rod, and mask are made of steel, not pudding, Laura Boros, the Lady of Infinity.
Our Beard Guard includes Lord Commander George the Golden, Lady Rita of the Coppermane the Unbound, Dance the Fervor, Bloody Ben Blackwood, Big Brian Blackwood, and Davin Mack, Knight of the Reeds, the Bog Knight. Last but not least is Lord Commander Richard the Ligerheart, wielder of Barry's Ankle Breaker, a flail with blue and silver Valyrian steel spikes, motto, Go Blue. Backed by Sir Kobe of House Stonesmith returns. Words are wind, deeds are stone, legitimate grandson of the Bastard of Runestone. And First Steward Zack of House Wild, Lord Shredder of the Spiral, wielder of the Valyrian steel axe Grail. So until next time, everybody, thank you for watching. Thanks for listening. Thanks for subscribing. Thanks for supporting and for discussing A Song of Ice and Fire with your friends. And Valar, reread us.